You're exhausted because you're resisting. They told you exhaustion comes from working too hard, from lack of sleep, from stress that never ends. But if that were true, why do you still feel drained, even on quiet days? Why does your mind refuse to rest, even when your body is still? Why do you feel heavy without knowing exactly why? The truth is, your exhaustion isn't coming from life itself. It's coming from the silent fight you're having with reality every moment, wishing things were different, replaying what already happened, fearing what might come next. Your mind treats the present like a problem to solve instead of a moment to live, and that constant resistance is what's draining your energy. Buddhist teachings revealed this long ago. Suffering begins the moment we argue with what is, and peace begins the moment we stop. Tonight, as you listen, something inside you will start to unclench. The pressure in your mind will soften. The tension in your body will ease. You may feel a quiet relief, like setting down armor you've been wearing for years. And when you wake up tomorrow, life may not look different, but it will feel different. Calmer, clearer, lighter, because you're no longer fighting it. This isn't just another audio to fall asleep to. This is what happens when you finally stop resisting. Are you ready? Let's begin. Something inside you already knows this is true. The tiredness you feel did not start today. It did not come from work, from responsibilities, or from how long you slept last night. It has been building quietly, layer by layer, every time your mind returned to something that cannot be changed. Every time you replayed a moment that is already gone. Every time you argued with a past that cannot hear you. What you are about to understand is where most of your energy has really been going. The mind has a strange habit. It treats the past as if it is still happening. A conversation from years ago can still make your chest tighten. A mistake you made can still send a wave of shame through your body. A betrayal can still feel fresh, even when the people involved have moved on with their lives. The body reacts as if the danger is present now, even when the event exists only as a memory. This is not weakness, it is conditioning. The brain is designed to protect you, so it keeps scanning old experiences for threats, hoping to prevent pain from happening again. But in doing so, it unknowingly keeps you trapped inside something that is already over. Arguing with what already happened is one of the most exhausting things a human being can do, because there is no resolution. You cannot win a debate with yesterday. You cannot negotiate with a memory. You cannot rewrite a moment that has already settled into history. Yet the mind keeps trying, as if persistence alone could bend time backward. Each replay feels like an attempt to fix something, but it only deepens the fatigue. It is like running on a treadmill expecting to arrive somewhere new. Notice how the mind uses phrases like, "I should have," "I shouldn't have," "Why did that happen?" or "If only I had known." These thoughts feel productive, as if you are analyzing and learning, but most of the time they are loops, not lessons. True learning leads to clarity and release. Rumination leads to confusion and heaviness. The difference is subtle but important. One frees you, the other binds you. Buddhist teachings describe this as clinging. Not clinging to the event itself, but to the idea that the event should have been different. Suffering is not created by what happened. It is created by the refusal to let the past be exactly as it was. This refusal is often invisible because it hides inside ordinary thinking. You may not say out loud that you reject the past, but every replay, every mental argument, every attempt to mentally edit the story is a quiet form of resistance. Your body pays the price for that resistance. When the mind revisits a painful memory, the nervous system activates as if the threat is present. Stress hormones rise, muscles tighten, breathing becomes shallow. Over time, this constant activation leads to a background exhaustion that never fully disappears. You may think you are tired because of your schedule, but the deeper cause is the emotional labor of carrying unfinished mental battles. There is also a hidden fear behind this pattern. Letting go of the argument with the past can feel like admitting defeat. It can feel like saying the pain did not matter, or that the injustice was acceptable. So the mind holds on, believing that staying upset is a form of loyalty to what happened. But acceptance is not agreement. It does not mean you approve of the event. It means you stop demanding that reality be different from what it was. You stop asking life to undo something it cannot undo. Think about how much energy is required to hold tension in the body for long periods of time. Now consider how long you have been holding tension toward the past. Years, sometimes decades. No muscle could endure that without fatigue. The mind is no different. It was not designed to carry unresolved conflict forever. Another reason this pattern persists is identity. The past often becomes part of the story you tell about yourself. The person who was wronged, the one who failed, the one who missed their chance. Letting go of the argument can feel like losing a piece of who you are. So the mind keeps revisiting the story, polishing it, defending it, reinforcing it. But identity built on pain requires constant maintenance, and that maintenance drains energy every day. You might notice that the more you think about certain memories, the more solid they feel, even if they are incomplete or distorted. Memory is not a recording. It changes each time you recall it. When you revisit the past with anger or regret, you strengthen those emotions, making the memory feel even heavier the next time. It becomes a cycle where the act of remembering deepens the wound instead of healing it. There is also a quiet addiction to familiarity. Painful memories are uncomfortable, but they are known. The mind prefers known discomfort to unknown peace. Letting go creates empty space, and empty space can feel threatening because it forces you to face the present without distraction. So the mind returns to the past, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it fears the silence that would remain without it. Buddhism teaches that freedom begins when you see thoughts as events in the mind, not as commands you must obey. A memory can arise without requiring your participation. You can notice it, feel whatever emotions appear, and allow it to pass without feeding it. This is not suppression, it is non-attachment. Suppression pushes the memory down while tension remains. Non-attachment allows the memory to exist without giving it control over your state. There is a profound difference between remembering and reliving. Remembering is neutral. It acknowledges what happened. Reliving is immersive. It pulls you back into the emotional storm as if it is happening now. Most exhaustion comes from reliving, not remembering. When you stop stepping into the storm each time it appears, the energy that was consumed by that process becomes available again. Forgiveness is often misunderstood in this context. It is not about excusing behavior or pretending nothing happened. It is about releasing the grip the past has on your present energy. You forgive not because the other person deserves it, but because you deserve peace. Holding resentment is like holding a burning object, expecting the other person to feel the heat. The longer you hold it, the more damage it does to you. The same principle applies to self-forgiveness. Many people are harsher toward themselves than they would ever be toward others. They replay their mistakes with a cruelty that no external critic could match. This internal punishment feels like responsibility, but it is actually another form of resistance. You cannot punish your past self into becoming wiser. Growth comes from understanding, not from endless self-attack. Acceptance of the past does not erase consequences, but it frees you from unnecessary suffering. It allows you to respond to the present instead of reacting to ghosts. When the mind is no longer occupied with old battles, attention returns to what is happening now, and life feels lighter, not because circumstances changed, but because the weight of resistance is gone. There is a quiet peace that emerges when you stop trying to solve something that has no solution. The mind becomes less noisy. The body relaxes. You begin to notice small details you previously overlooked. The rhythm of your breathing, the feeling of your feet on the ground, the subtle sense of being alive in this moment. These are not dramatic changes, but they are signs that energy is returning to where it belongs. You may also discover that many fears about the future are extensions of unresolved past experiences. When you release the past, the future loses some of its threat because you are no longer projecting old pain onto what has not yet happened. Anxiety decreases not because you control the future, but because you are no longer haunted by yesterday. Letting go is not a single decision. It is a practice. The mind will return to old patterns, especially when triggered. Each time it does, you have another opportunity to notice the habit and gently disengage. Over time, the intervals between these loops grow longer and the intensity decreases. What once consumed hours of mental energy may shrink to a brief flicker of thought. Eventually, you realize that the past has no power on its own. Its influence comes from the attention you give it. When attention returns to the present, the past becomes quieter, like a distant echo instead of a constant noise. This is where real rest begins, not the rest that comes from sleep alone, but the rest that comes from no longer carrying unnecessary burdens. The exhaustion you have been feeling is not proof that you are broken. It is evidence that you have been fighting battles that ended long ago. When you stop fighting, the energy that was trapped in those conflicts becomes available for living, creating, connecting, and simply being here. And as that energy returns, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel a sense of space inside yourself, a calm that does not depend on circumstances, a quiet confidence that you can face whatever comes next without dragging the past behind you. This is the hidden relief that arrives when you finally stop arguing with what already happened. As the weight of the past begins to loosen, another layer of tension quietly reveals itself. Even when you stop replaying old memories, a different struggle continues in the background, a resistance not to what happened, but to what is happening right now. The exhaustion does not disappear completely because the mind is still bracing itself against reality, as if reality were something hostile. There is a deeper reason for this. And once you see it, you begin to understand why peace can feel unfamiliar at first. Something in you has been trained to treat life like a battlefield, not because you chose it, but because the human mind evolved to survive danger, not to rest in calm. Long before modern life, survival depended on detecting threats quickly and reacting before it was too late. The brain learned to scan constantly, to question everything, to assume that what is unknown could be dangerous. That ancient system is still active today, even when the threats are no longer physical. Now it turns everyday uncertainty into something that feels like an enemy. This is why acceptance can feel uncomfortable. When you stop resisting, the survival system interprets it as lowering your guard. It confuses peace with vulnerability. It sends signals that say, if you relax, something bad will happen. So the mind keeps pushing, analyzing, worrying, controlling, not because it enjoys tension, but because it believes tension equals safety. You might notice how difficult it is to simply allow things to be unresolved. A delayed message, an unclear situation, a decision that has not yet been made, the mind rushes to fill the gap. It wants closure immediately because uncertainty feels threatening. Acceptance, which means allowing uncertainty to exist without panic, feels like stepping into open space without armor. The body tightens, thoughts accelerate, and the urge to regain control becomes overwhelming. Control becomes the mind's favorite strategy for dealing with fear. If it can predict, organize, plan, and manage everything, then maybe nothing will go wrong. But reality does not follow plans perfectly. Life changes direction without asking permission. When events unfold differently than expected, the mind experiences it as a failure of control, not as a natural part of existence. It reacts with frustration, anxiety, or anger, as if reality has betrayed it. This creates a constant low-level conflict between how life is and how the mind insists it should be. That conflict is exhausting because it never truly ends. Even small inconveniences become personal battles. Traffic becomes an insult. Delays become injustices. Other people's choices feel like obstacles placed deliberately in your path. The mind takes everything personally because it sees itself as the center of the story. Buddhist teachings describe this as the illusion of control, the belief that you are supposed to shape every outcome and prevent every discomfort. When that illusion breaks, instead of recognizing it as an illusion, the mind doubles down. It tries harder. It tightens its grip. It refuses to accept that some aspects of life are simply not controllable. This refusal is what drains energy more than the situation itself. Acceptance is often misunderstood as passivity, but it is actually clarity. It means seeing what is within your influence and what is not, without wasting energy on the latter. The survival mind struggles with this distinction because it prefers certainty over truth. It would rather maintain the illusion that everything can be controlled than face the reality that some things cannot. There is also a deeper identity issue at play. Many people define themselves by their ability to manage, fix, and overcome. Control becomes part of who they believe they are. When life presents something that cannot be fixed, it feels like a threat to that identity. Accepting reality then feels like admitting weakness, even though it is actually a form of wisdom. Strength is not always pushing harder. Sometimes it is knowing when pushing creates more harm than good. The body reflects this inner battle. Chronic tension in the shoulders, jaw, and stomach often comes from the nervous system preparing for action that never arrives. It is like holding a shield up all day in case an attack happens. Eventually the muscles tire, breathing becomes shallow, and fatigue spreads through the entire system. The body is not exhausted from effort alone, it is exhausted from constant readiness. Another way the mind turns reality into an enemy is through comparison. It measures the present against an imagined version of how things should be. If reality falls short, dissatisfaction appears. Instead of appreciating what exists, attention moves to what is missing. This keeps the mind in a perpetual state of deficiency, always chasing an improved version of life that may never arrive. Acceptance interrupts this cycle by shifting focus from evaluation to observation. There is also fear of unpredictability. The mind prefers known discomfort to unknown possibility because at least known discomfort feels manageable. When life changes direction, the survival system interprets it as danger. It triggers resistance not because change is harmful, but because change is unfamiliar. Acceptance means allowing life to move without needing guarantees, and that feels risky to a mind trained to avoid risk at all costs. Over time, living in this defensive mode becomes normal. You may not even notice the constant tension because it has always been there. Calm can feel strange, almost suspicious, as if something is wrong simply because nothing is wrong. This is why some people feel uneasy when life is peaceful. Their nervous system is conditioned to expect problems. The turning point comes when you realize that the survival mechanism is outdated in many situations. It was designed for immediate physical threats, not for emails, social interactions, or future plans. Yet it reacts to these modern stresses with the same intensity. Understanding this allows you to step back and question the urgency your mind creates. Not every discomfort is a crisis. Not every uncertainty requires action. Acceptance does not remove responsibility. You still act where action is needed. The difference is that action comes from clarity instead of fear. When you are not fighting reality, you can see more clearly what actually matters. Decisions become simpler because they are no longer clouded by the need to control every variable. There is also a quiet trust that develops. Not trust that everything will go your way, but trust that you can handle whatever comes. This trust reduces the need for constant vigilance. The nervous system begins to relax because it no longer believes survival depends on perpetual tension. As this shift happens, energy that was tied up in resistance becomes available for presence. You start to experience moments fully instead of evaluating them. Conversations feel lighter because you are not trying to steer them toward a specific outcome. Work feels less draining because you are focused on the task itself instead of worrying about every possible result. The mind may still attempt to regain control, especially during stress, but you begin to recognize the pattern sooner. Instead of being pulled into the battle, you can pause and return to the present. This pause is powerful. It interrupts the automatic reaction and creates space for a different response. Gradually, reality stops feeling like something to defeat and starts feeling like something to participate in. Life becomes less of a struggle and more of a flow. Challenges still exist, but they are approached with flexibility rather than resistance. There is a sense of moving with events instead of pushing against them. This does not mean you become indifferent. It means you become responsive instead of reactive. You engage with life from a place of steadiness rather than urgency. The exhaustion that came from constant opposition begins to fade because you are no longer wasting energy on battles that cannot be won. What remains is a quieter kind of strength. Not the tense strength of someone bracing for impact, but the grounded strength of someone who knows they do not have to fight everything that arises. Reality is no longer an enemy. It is simply the field in which your life unfolds. And as this understanding settles in, a new possibility appears. The possibility of living without the constant need to defend yourself from existence itself. That is where true rest begins, not as an escape from life, but as a way of being fully here without resistance. When you stop treating reality like an enemy, a different question begins to surface. If life itself is no longer the thing draining you, then what is? Why does the exhaustion remain even when you are no longer fighting the present moment in the same way? The answer is quieter, more personal, and harder to admit. Sometimes the body is not tired from what you are doing, but from what you are not allowing yourself to acknowledge. There is a kind of fatigue that sleep does not fix. It lingers even after rest, even after a calm day, even when nothing demanding has happened. It feels heavy, dull, and strangely emotional at the same time. This is not simply physical tiredness. It is the body's way of signaling that something inside you is out of alignment. The life you are living on the outside does not fully match what you know on the inside. And maintaining that gap requires constant energy. Every person carries an inner knowing, a quiet sense of what feels true and what does not. It shows up as subtle discomfort when you say yes but want to say no, when you stay where you no longer belong, when you pretend to be fine while something inside you is asking for change. Ignoring that inner signal does not silence it. It pushes the tension into the body. Muscles tighten, breathing becomes shallow, posture collapses, and energy drops because the body is holding something that the mind refuses to face. Living in misalignment is like driving with the brakes slightly pressed. The car still moves, but the effort required is much greater than it should be. Over time, the system overheats. You may continue functioning, but everything feels heavier than it needs to be. Tasks that should be simple feel overwhelming because part of your energy is constantly being used to maintain the illusion that everything is fine. This often happens in environments where you cannot be fully yourself. a job that contradicts your values, relationships where you suppress your thoughts, roles you accepted out of obligation rather than choice. Each day spent performing a version of yourself that does not feel authentic adds another layer of exhaustion. The body senses the tension between who you are and who you are pretending to be, and it protests by slowing you down. Fatigue becomes a message rather than a malfunction. It is the body saying, something is not right, and I cannot keep carrying this without acknowledgement. Many people try to override this message with caffeine, distractions, or pushing themselves harder, believing that productivity will solve the problem. But pushing through misalignment only deepens the disconnect. It is like turning up the volume on music to drown out a warning alarm instead of addressing what triggered it. There is also emotional truth that goes unlived. Feelings that were never expressed, grief that was never processed, anger that was never allowed to exist. These emotions do not disappear just because they were ignored. They settle into the nervous system, creating a background tension that consumes energy. The effort required to keep them suppressed is constant, even if you are not consciously aware of it. Buddhist teachings emphasize the importance of acknowledging reality as it is, including internal reality. When you deny what you feel or what you know, you create resistance not only to external life but to your own experience. This inner resistance is particularly draining because it splits your attention. One part of you is trying to maintain normalcy while another part is quietly asking to be heard. There is also the fatigue of living by expectations that were never truly yours. Many people follow paths chosen by family, culture, or fear rather than personal conviction. They achieve milestones that look successful from the outside but feel empty on the inside. The energy required to maintain motivation for something that does not resonate with you is enormous. Without genuine connection to what you are doing, effort feels mechanical instead of meaningful. Your body recognizes meaning even when your mind ignores it. When actions align with purpose, energy tends to increase despite effort. When actions contradict purpose, energy decreases despite rest. This is why you can spend hours on something you care about and feel alive, yet feel drained after a short time doing something that feels meaningless. The difference is not the activity itself, but the alignment behind it. There is also fear of change that keeps people in situations they have outgrown. The unknown feels risky, so staying in familiar discomfort seems safer. But the body senses stagnation. It responds with heaviness, lack of motivation, and low vitality because growth is being suppressed. Life has a natural tendency toward movement and evolution. When you resist that movement, tension builds. Another layer of this exhaustion comes from unspoken boundaries. Saying yes when you want to say no, tolerating behavior that drains you, allowing responsibilities that exceed your capacity. Each time you override your limits, you send a message to your body that your needs are secondary. Over time, the body stops cooperating fully. Energy decreases because it no longer trusts that you will protect it from overload. There is also the silent cost of self-betrayal. When you act against your values to avoid conflict or rejection, something inside you withdraws, confidence weakens, motivation fades, and fatigue increases because maintaining self-respect requires honesty. Without it, even success feels hollow because it was achieved at the expense of authenticity. The body does not speak in words, but it communicates through sensations. Tightness in the chest, heaviness in the limbs, persistent tiredness, lack of enthusiasm. These signals are often interpreted as problems to eliminate rather than messages to understand. When you listen instead of suppressing them, you may discover that they point toward changes you have been postponing. There is also a difference between rest and avoidance. True rest restores energy because it allows integration. Avoidance temporarily numbs discomfort, but leaves the underlying misalignment untouched. You can rest all day and still feel tired if the real issue is not physical exertion, but emotional or existential tension. Facing unlived truth requires courage, because it may lead to decisions that disrupt comfort. Admitting that a relationship no longer works, that a career path feels wrong, that a part of you has been neglected for years. These realizations can be unsettling, but they also release energy that was trapped in denial. Clarity, even when difficult, is less exhausting than confusion. Honesty with yourself reduces internal friction. When you acknowledge what you truly want, what you truly feel, and what you truly need, the body begins to relax because it no longer has to carry the burden of concealment. Alignment does not guarantee ease, but it removes the unnecessary effort of pretending. There is also a deeper level of truth that relates to purpose. Not a grand mission, but a sense that your life direction resonates with who you are becoming. Without this resonance, even ordinary tasks can feel heavy because they lack context. When actions connect to a meaningful direction, energy flows more naturally. The process of realignment often begins with small adjustments rather than dramatic changes. Speaking honestly in one conversation, setting one boundary, making one decision that reflects your values instead of fear. Each step reduces the gap between inner knowing and outer life. As that gap closes, fatigue decreases because the body is no longer compensating for contradiction. You may also notice that clarity brings unexpected relief. Even when the truth is difficult, there is comfort in no longer pretending. The nervous system settles because uncertainty is replaced by direction. Energy returns not because circumstances improved instantly, but because the internal struggle has eased. Over time, living in alignment creates resilience. Challenges still arise, but they do not drain you in the same way because you are not simultaneously fighting yourself. Effort feels purposeful instead of forced. Rest feels restorative instead of insufficient. The body cooperates because it senses coherence between thought, emotion, and action. This is why some people appear energized despite demanding lives, while others feel depleted despite minimal responsibilities. The difference is not only external workload, but internal alignment. When your life reflects your truth, energy circulates. When it contradicts your truth, energy stagnates. Exhaustion, then, is not always a problem to fix, but a signal to interpret. It invites you to ask where you have been silent when you needed to speak, compliant when you needed to stand firm, passive when you needed to choose. It points toward parts of your life that are waiting for honesty. As you begin to listen, the relationship with your body changes. Instead of seeing fatigue as an enemy, you see it as guidance. It directs you toward what needs attention, adjustment, or release. The body becomes an ally rather than an obstacle. And when alignment gradually replaces resistance, a different kind of vitality emerges. Not frantic energy, but steady strength. A sense that you are moving in the right direction even if the path is uncertain. The exhaustion that once felt mysterious starts to make sense because you understand what it was trying to tell you. This is the quiet restoration that happens when you stop living against your own truth. Not by forcing yourself into a new identity, but by allowing who you already are to shape the way you live. Energy returns because nothing inside you is being held back anymore. As you begin to live closer to your own truth, another source of hidden exhaustion becomes easier to notice. Even when you are no longer replaying the past, even when you stop betraying what you feel inside, there can still be a quiet tension running underneath the day. It shows up in small sighs, in impatience, in the sense that something is slightly off, even when nothing is obviously wrong. This is the fatigue of wishing the present moment were different. There is a subtle habit in the human mind that rarely gets questioned. It constantly edits reality in real time. It compares what is happening with what it believes should be happening instead. The room should be quieter. The weather should be better. People should behave differently. You should feel more motivated, more confident, more certain. These thoughts appear so quickly that they feel automatic, almost invisible. Yet each one creates a tiny friction between you and the moment you are actually living. This friction consumes energy because it divides your attention. Part of your mind is dealing with reality, while another part is resisting it. It is like trying to walk forward while someone is gently pulling you backward at the same time. The movement continues, but the effort required is much greater than necessary. Subtle dissatisfaction rarely feels dramatic. It does not always look like anger or despair. More often it appears as restlessness, boredom, or the constant urge to check something new. The mind looks for stimulation, not because the moment is empty, but because it refuses to settle into what already exists. It treats the present as a waiting room instead of a place where life is actually happening. This constant scanning for a better version of now drains cognitive resources. The brain uses energy to maintain focus, regulate emotions, and process information. When part of that capacity is occupied by dissatisfaction, less energy remains for clarity, creativity, and calm. Tasks feel harder not because they are difficult, but because your attention is fragmented. Buddhist teachings describe this as craving, not only craving for objects or achievements, but craving for a different experience than the one unfolding. It is the belief that fulfillment exists somewhere else, later elsewhere, after conditions change. As long as this belief persists, the present moment feels insufficient. Life becomes a series of transitions instead of a place you can fully inhabit. Notice how often thoughts begin with, "I'll feel better when." When the project is finished, when the weekend arrives, when someone responds, when circumstances improve. This pattern postpones contentment indefinitely. Even when one condition is met, the mind quickly moves to the next requirement. Satisfaction becomes temporary because it depends on outcomes rather than presence. There is also the habit of micro-judgment, evaluating everything as good or bad, useful or pointless, pleasant or annoying. While evaluation can be practical in certain situations, constant judgment creates tension. It turns simple experiences into mental debates. Instead of just hearing a sound, you decide whether it should exist. Instead of simply noticing a delay, you interpret it as an inconvenience. Each judgment tightens resistance. The body reflects this tension. Small contractions in the muscles, shallow breathing, subtle agitation in the nervous system. These reactions are so mild that they often go unnoticed, yet they accumulate throughout the day. By evening, the body feels tired, even if physical activity was minimal, because it has been in a low-level defensive state for hours. Another aspect of this exhaustion is the pressure to optimize every moment. The belief that time must always be used productively or meaningfully. When the present does not meet that expectation, guilt or anxiety appears. Relaxation becomes difficult because the mind insists there must be something more important to do. This prevents genuine rest, turning even downtime into a form of effort. Technology amplifies this pattern. Constant exposure to curated images of other people's lives creates the impression that something better is always happening somewhere else. Your current experience feels inadequate in comparison, even if it is objectively peaceful. The mind becomes conditioned to seek novelty instead of depth, stimulation instead of stillness. There is also the fear of missing out, which keeps attention scattered. If you fully commit to what is in front of you, you must accept that you are not somewhere else. The mind resists this exclusivity. It wants multiple possibilities open at once, which prevents immersion in any single experience. This fragmentation is mentally exhausting because it requires constant switching of focus. Dissatisfaction also affects relationships. When you are mentally negotiating with the present, you are not fully available to the people around you. Conversations become partial. Listening becomes selective. Others sense the absence, even if they cannot name it. This creates distance, which then becomes another source of discomfort, reinforcing the cycle. There is a misconception that wanting things to be different is necessary for progress. While improvement requires intention, constant discontent is not the same as purposeful change. Change can come from clarity and vision rather than frustration. In fact, excessive dissatisfaction often clouds judgment, making decisions reactive instead of thoughtful. Acceptance of the present does not eliminate desire or ambition. It simply removes the emotional resistance that makes the journey heavier. When you are not fighting the current moment, you can act more effectively because your energy is not divided. Effort becomes focused instead of strained. A useful shift is learning to observe discomfort without immediately trying to escape it, noticing boredom without reaching for distraction, feeling impatience without forcing resolution, allowing silence without filling it. These small practices train the mind to coexist with the present instead of constantly modifying it. Over time, this reduces the background noise in your thoughts. Moments begin to feel fuller, not because they changed, but because you are finally present for them. Simple activities regain depth. Eating, walking, resting, talking, experiences that once felt routine become vivid because your attention is no longer elsewhere. There is also a sense of relief that comes from dropping the internal demand that life must always be exciting or meaningful. Ordinary moments stop feeling like obstacles and start feeling like the fabric of life itself. This shift reduces pressure, allowing the nervous system to relax. You may also notice that creativity increases when dissatisfaction decreases. A calm mind has more capacity for insight because it is not preoccupied with complaints. Solutions appear more easily when resistance fades. This is why some of the most profound ideas arise during quiet moments rather than during frantic activity. Gratitude naturally emerges from this state, not as a forced exercise, but as a recognition of what is already here. When you are not focused on what is missing, you become aware of what is present. This awareness brings a sense of sufficiency that reduces the urge to chase constant improvement. There is also a deeper freedom in realizing that peace is not dependent on perfect conditions. Waiting for the ideal moment to feel calm is another form of resistance. Peace becomes available when you stop postponing it. It is less about achieving a state and more about allowing the absence of struggle. This does not mean every moment will feel pleasant. Acceptance includes discomfort without adding extra layers of resistance. Pain without mental argument is still pain, but it is not amplified by frustration. Difficult situations become manageable because you are not simultaneously fighting reality. As this practice deepens, time itself feels different. Days no longer blur together in a rush toward the future. Each moment stands on its own, complete rather than transitional. Life feels longer not because more time exists, but because you are actually living the time you have. The exhaustion that once felt mysterious begins to dissolve because the constant internal negotiation has stopped. You are no longer spending energy wishing the present away. Instead, you are using that energy to engage with what is here. This shift may seem small, almost insignificant, but its impact is profound. When subtle dissatisfaction disappears, a quiet contentment takes its place. Not excitement, not dramatic happiness, but a steady sense that this moment is enough. And from that sense of enoughness, energy naturally returns. Not forced energy driven by pressure, but organic vitality that comes from being aligned with the flow of life rather than pushing against it. Even as you begin to settle into the present and release the quiet habit of wishing this moment were different, there is another place the mind escapes to when it cannot control now. It travels backward, but not to replay what happened. It travels to construct versions of what could have happened. Versions where one decision changed everything. Versions where the right words were spoken, the right path was chosen, the right opportunity was taken. These invisible lives feel so close that they almost hurt. The mind has a powerful ability to simulate reality. It can build entire alternate stories from a single memory, adjusting small details until a completely different life appears. In these imagined timelines, mistakes are corrected, relationships unfold perfectly, success arrives sooner, pain never enters. The contrast between these imagined outcomes and actual life creates a quiet sorrow that is difficult to explain because nothing tangible is missing, yet something feels lost. This attachment to alternate timelines drains energy because the mind is constantly comparing what exists with what never existed. It creates a sense of deficiency that no real achievement can satisfy. Even when life improves, the imagined version remains slightly better, slightly smoother, slightly more fulfilling. Satisfaction becomes impossible because the comparison is against a fantasy designed to be ideal. Regret often fuels this pattern. Regret is not simply remembering a mistake. It is the belief that the mistake permanently destroyed a better future. The mind returns to the moment repeatedly, searching for a way to undo it, as if enough analysis could reverse time. This creates a loop where the past is not only remembered, but reshaped into a turning point that defines everything that followed. Buddhist teachings describe this as attachment to illusion. The alternate timeline feels real because the emotional response to it is real, but the scenario itself has no substance. Clinging to it creates suffering because it pulls attention away from the only timeline that exists. Life becomes overshadowed by a ghost story of what might have been. There is also a subtle arrogance hidden in this habit. The belief that you could have predicted outcomes perfectly if only you had chosen differently. In reality, every decision is made with limited information. You cannot know how the alternate path would have unfolded. It might have led to challenges just as complex, just as painful, just as unexpected. The mind edits these possibilities out, keeping only the imagined benefits while ignoring potential difficulties. Attachment to alternate timelines also creates hesitation in the present. Fear of repeating past mistakes makes decision-making heavier. You may delay action because you are trying to guarantee a perfect outcome, something that is impossible. This paralysis drains energy because the mind is constantly calculating instead of engaging. There is also the illusion that happiness exists in a specific version of life that you narrowly missed. This belief keeps you from recognizing opportunities that exist now because they do not match the imagined script. You become blind to the potential in your current circumstances because you are measuring them against a fictional standard. Relationships can be affected by this pattern as well. You may compare a current partner to someone from the past or to an imagined ideal. You may wonder how life would feel if you had stayed, left earlier, spoken differently. This comparison prevents full connection because part of your attention is invested in someone who exists only in memory or imagination. Career paths often trigger similar thoughts. Questions about whether a different field, location, or risk would have led to greater success. While reflection can be useful for growth, obsession traps you in evaluation instead of progress. Energy that could be used to build something new is spent analyzing something that cannot be changed. The brain is wired to search for patterns and meaning, so it tries to make sense of outcomes by tracing them back to decisions. This can create the illusion that life is a linear chain of cause and effect, where one choice determines everything. In reality, countless variables shape each moment, focusing on a single decision as the turning point oversimplifies a complex system and intensifies regret unnecessarily. There is also the emotional comfort of staying in the story of what could have been. As painful as it is, it provides a sense of continuity. Letting go means accepting that the imagined life will never exist, and that can feel like a second loss. Grieving something that never happened is a strange experience because there is no tangible object to mourn, yet the feeling of absence is real. Another layer of exhaustion comes from identity built around missed potential. Seeing yourself as someone who almost succeeded, almost found love, almost lived fully. This narrative can become a quiet prison because it defines you by absence rather than presence. It keeps attention on what is lacking instead of what is available. Social comparison intensifies this attachment. Seeing others achieve milestones that align with your imagined timeline reinforces the belief that you are behind. It ignores the uniqueness of each life path and reduces existence to a race with invisible checkpoints. The pressure to catch up adds urgency to an already heavy emotional load. There is also fear that letting go of the alternate timeline means settling for less. Acceptance is mistaken for resignation. In truth, releasing attachment frees energy to create new possibilities instead of mourning lost ones. It shifts focus from what cannot be reclaimed to what can still be shaped. Mindfulness practices address this by grounding attention in immediate experience. Sensations, sounds, breath, physical surroundings. These anchors bring you back to the only place where life is happening. The imagined timeline loses intensity when you stop feeding it with attention. There is a quiet strength in acknowledging that life unfolds through uncertainty. You could not have guaranteed a better outcome because the future is not a controlled experiment. Accepting this reduces the burden of responsibility for things beyond your influence. Over time, you may discover that some aspects of your current life exist precisely because of the decisions you regret. Relationships formed, skills developed, perspectives gained. The alternate timeline, while appealing, would have erased these elements. This realization softens the sharpness of regret and replaces it with curiosity about how events interconnected. There is also beauty in unpredictability. The fact that life did not follow a perfect script means it remains open. Surprises, encounters, opportunities that could not have been planned become possible. Attachment to a fixed storyline prevents you from appreciating this openness. Compassion toward yourself plays a crucial role here. Recognizing that you made decisions with the knowledge and emotional capacity you had at the time. Blame loses intensity when you see your past self as someone doing the best they could under specific circumstances rather than as someone who ruined everything. Forgiveness becomes relevant again, not as a moral gesture but as a practical release. Holding on to alternate timelines keeps wounds active. Forgiving yourself allows those wounds to close, freeing energy that was tied up in self-judgment. The mind may still revisit imagined scenarios occasionally, especially during quiet moments. The difference is that you no longer follow the story to its emotional conclusion. You notice it, acknowledge it, and return to the present without engaging. This reduces its power gradually. As attachment loosens, gratitude for what exists begins to grow naturally. Not forced positivity, but genuine appreciation for experiences that were once overlooked because they did not match the imagined ideal. Life feels less like a consolation prize and more like a unique journey that could not have been replicated. Creativity often emerges from this state because attention is no longer trapped in comparison. You can explore possibilities without the pressure of correcting the past. New directions appear that were invisible before because your gaze was fixed backward. Energy returns in subtle ways, motivation increases, curiosity replaces rumination, and the sense of being stuck fades. You start to feel capable of shaping your future rather than haunted by your past. The timeline you are living in regains significance because it is no longer overshadowed by hypothetical alternatives. Peace arrives not as a dramatic revelation, but as the absence of constant mental travel. You are here, not elsewhere. The simplicity of this realization reduces tension more than any complex strategy could. Life begins to feel lighter because you are no longer carrying invisible versions of yourself and wondering why you cannot become them. You are simply yourself, moving forward in the only direction that exists. And in that forward movement, a quiet freedom appears, the freedom from needing life to match an imagined script, the freedom to participate fully in the story that is actually unfolding, the freedom to rest in the understanding that nothing real was lost, only possibilities that were never meant to be lived. As the pull of imagined lives begins to loosen and attention returns to the path you are actually walking, something else becomes easier to feel, not in your thoughts, but in your body, a tightness that never fully leaves, a background alertness that makes true rest feel distant. Even when nothing is wrong, the body behaves as if something is about to happen. This is where the hidden cost of resistance becomes physical. There is a state many people live in without realizing it. It is not full panic, not obvious fear, but a constant low-grade readiness. The shoulders remain slightly tense. The jaw rarely unclenches. Breathing stays shallow instead of deep. Sleep feels light, easily interrupted. The body is not in danger, yet it is not fully at ease either. This is what happens when inner opposition becomes chronic. The nervous system stops believing that it is safe to relax. The human nervous system is designed to respond quickly to threats and return to calm once the danger passes. In earlier times, this system protected survival during immediate physical risks. After the threat ended, the body released tension and restored balance, but modern stress is rarely short-lived. Psychological resistance, fighting circumstances, suppressing emotions, holding tension toward reality, keeps the threat response active even when no physical danger exists. When the mind constantly signals that something is wrong, the body listens. Stress hormones circulate longer than necessary. The heart rate stays slightly elevated. Digestion slows because the body prioritizes readiness over restoration. Over time, this creates exhaustion that feels deeper than ordinary tiredness because the system has not experienced genuine recovery. Inner opposition sends mixed signals. One part of you is trying to function normally, while another part is rejecting what is happening. This conflict prevents the nervous system from settling. It is like pressing the accelerator and the brake at the same time. Movement continues, but the strain increases with every moment. There are many subtle forms of inner opposition, pretending to be calm while feeling overwhelmed, forcing positivity while carrying unresolved fear, staying in environments that feel unsafe emotionally while telling yourself everything is fine. Each contradiction between internal truth and external behavior confuses the body. It cannot determine whether it should relax or prepare for danger, so it remains in a state of vigilance. Chronic vigilance depletes energy because it requires continuous monitoring of surroundings and internal states. The brain scans for problems, anticipating what could go wrong next. This anticipation itself becomes a source of stress. You may feel tense before anything actually happens because the body is preparing for possibilities rather than responding to realities. Over time, this pattern can lead to what feels like collapse. Motivation fades. Concentration weakens. Tasks that once felt manageable become overwhelming. This is not laziness or lack of discipline. It is the nervous system signaling that it has been under strain for too long without relief. There is also a cycle between mental resistance and physical symptoms. Physical tension reinforces anxious thoughts, which then increase tension further. Breaking this cycle requires addressing both sides. Understanding that the body is reacting to perceived threat allows you to approach symptoms with compassion rather than frustration. Breathing patterns reveal a lot about this state. Shallow breathing keeps the body in alert mode, while deep, slow breathing signals safety. Many people unconsciously hold their breath during stress, which intensifies the sense of urgency. Learning to breathe fully again can gradually shift the nervous system toward calm. Movement is another way the body processes tension. When stress accumulates without release, muscles remain contracted. Gentle movement, stretching or walking can help discharge stored energy. This is not about exercise for performance, but about restoring circulation and allowing the body to complete stress responses that were interrupted. Sleep disruption is also common in chronic inner opposition. The mind continues processing unresolved tension even during rest. Dreams may feel intense or fragmented. Waking up tired despite hours in bed indicates that the nervous system never fully entered restorative states. There is also a social dimension to this exhaustion. Being around people who require constant self-monitoring can keep the body in alert mode. If you feel you must watch your words, suppress reactions, or anticipate criticism, the nervous system remains guarded. Safe connections where you can relax without performance become essential for recovery. Technology and constant stimulation contribute to this condition as well. Continuous exposure to information prevents mental quiet. Notifications, news, and endless content keep the brain engaged without pause. Without periods of stillness, the nervous system never fully resets. Healing begins when inner opposition decreases. Acceptance reduces the signals of danger because the mind stops framing reality as a threat. This does not eliminate challenges, but it changes the body's response to them. Instead of reacting with immediate tension, you approach situations with steadiness. Trust also plays a role. Trust not in perfect outcomes, but in your ability to respond to whatever arises. This trust reduces the need for constant vigilance. The nervous system relaxes when it senses that you are capable rather than fragile. Practices that cultivate presence support this process. Paying attention to physical sensations, grounding awareness in the body, noticing the environment without judgment. These actions anchor you in the present, where most threats are absent. The body learns that safety exists here and now. Over time, moments of calm become more frequent. The baseline shifts from tension to neutrality. You may still experience stress, but it no longer dominates every moment. Recovery becomes quicker because the system remembers how to return to balance. There is also an emotional component to nervous system healing. Allowing feelings to surface without suppression reduces internal conflict. Tears, anger, relief. These responses release energy that was held in restraint. Emotional expression signals that the threat has passed. Nutrition and physical care matter as well. Chronic stress depletes resources the body needs to repair itself. Supporting recovery through rest, nourishment, and hydration helps restore resilience. The body is not separate from the mind. Both influence each other continuously. As stability returns, clarity improves. Decision-making becomes easier because thoughts are not clouded by constant urgency. Creativity reappears because the brain is no longer focused solely on survival. Relationships deepen because you are present instead of guarded. You may also notice a renewed sensitivity to environments and habits that increase tension. This awareness allows you to make choices that protect your energy rather than deplete it. Boundaries become clearer because you recognize their physical impact. Gradually, the feeling of collapse transforms into a sense of grounded strength. Not the tense strength of endurance, but the quiet strength of resilience. The body feels lighter because it is no longer carrying the burden of constant defense. Peace becomes a physical experience, not just an idea. Muscles soften, breathing deepens, posture opens. These changes reflect a nervous system that finally trusts that it does not need to fight every moment. Life still contains uncertainty, but uncertainty no longer triggers immediate alarm. You move through situations with awareness instead of tension. Energy flows toward living rather than surviving. And in that shift, exhaustion begins to fade. Not because demands disappeared, but because the inner war that consumed your resources has ended. What remains is a steady capacity to face reality without opposition, allowing the body to rest even while life continues to unfold. As the nervous system begins to come back from that constant low-grade fight, you start noticing something else. The tension was never only about stress. It was also about a habit the mind calls responsibility, but the body experiences as pressure. A hidden rule that says, if I don't keep control, everything will fall apart. And even when your body finally gets a few calm moments, the mind still reaches for the steering wheel. It still tries to manage life into safety. It still hunts for certainty the way a thirsty person hunts for water. That is where a deeper kind of exhaustion is born. Some tiredness comes from overwork. This one comes from over-control. It doesn't just drain your energy, it drains your spirit. It makes life feel tight, heavy, and joyless, even when things are going fine. It's the kind of burnout that feels like your inner light is dimmer than it used to be, and you can't explain why. Control addiction is not always loud. It doesn't always look like someone barking orders or dominating a room. Sometimes it looks like being responsible. Sometimes it looks like planning ahead. Sometimes it looks like not wanting problems. Sometimes it looks like being strong. But underneath, it's the same thing. A belief that peace is only possible if life becomes predictable. The mind starts treating uncertainty like an emergency. It tries to lock everything into place. It wants guarantees. It wants clean answers. It wants life to behave. And the more it tries to force life into certainty, the more exhausted it becomes, because life is not built to stay still. Here is the paradox. The more you chase control, the more fragile you feel. The more you try to secure everything, the more anxious you become, because control is never complete. There is always one more variable, one more risk, one more thing that could go wrong. One more person who could change, one more situation you can't predict. So the mind keeps working, it keeps scanning, it keeps rehearsing, it keeps planning, it keeps gripping, and slowly, without noticing, you stop living. You start managing. This is why control addiction creates spiritual burnout, not because planning is bad, but because compulsive control turns life into a project instead of an experience. It turns your inner world into a control room with alarms going off all day. It makes you feel like you're always on duty. Buddhist teachings point directly at this. They say suffering comes from clinging, and clinging is not only to people or possessions, it is also clinging to outcomes, clinging to certainty, clinging to how it must go. When you cling to certainty, you are secretly demanding that reality obey you. Even if you never say it out loud, the body feels the demand. It feels the pressure of trying to hold the world in a fixed shape. That pressure becomes tension. That tension becomes fatigue. That fatigue becomes a dull emptiness. At first, control feels like strength. It feels like competence. It feels like protection. It can even bring rewards. People praise you for being organized, for being reliable, for handling things, for not falling apart. But control addiction has a hidden cost. It teaches you that you are only safe when everything is handled, and that belief keeps you trapped in a state of constant monitoring. Control addiction often begins as a response to pain. If life once felt chaotic, unpredictable, or unsafe, the mind learns to tighten. If someone betrayed you, the mind tries to prevent it from ever happening again. If you grew up around instability, the mind becomes a planner. If you were punished for mistakes, the mind becomes perfectionistic. If you were neglected, the mind learns to rely only on itself. So, control becomes a coping mechanism. It is the mind saying, I will never be caught off guard again. But life cannot promise that. So the coping mechanism becomes a prison. You can see it in the small ways. The need to overthink every message before sending. The urge to replay conversations to make sure you didn't say the wrong thing. The need to know what someone thinks of you. The need to map out the future before you take the first step. The inability to relax unless everything is done. The feeling of guilt when you rest. The pressure to always be improving. Even the desire to finally fix yourself can become control addiction, because it implies that you cannot be at peace until you become a different version of you. It turns healing into another control project. Spiritual burnout happens when the inner self becomes tired of being treated like a machine. There is a part of you that does not want to be managed. It wants to breathe. It wants to feel. It wants to trust. It wants to flow. It wants to live in a way that is not constantly calculated. But control addiction blocks that. It blocks surrender. It blocks softness. It blocks presence. It blocks joy that has no reason. It blocks peace that does not depend on outcomes. This is why you can have everything in order and still feel empty. Because you are not exhausted from life. You are exhausted from your grip on life. The mind confuses control with power. Buddhism makes a sharp distinction here. Real power is not forcing reality to cooperate. Real power is meeting reality without fear. Real power is the ability to stay grounded even when things are uncertain. Real power is not the ability to predict everything, but the ability to respond with clarity. Control addiction does the opposite. It makes your stability dependent on things outside you. It says, I will be calm when the situation is calm. That is not inner peace, that is conditional peace. And conditional peace is fragile. This addiction also destroys your relationship with the present moment. Because the present moment is never fully controllable. It is alive. It moves. It changes. It surprises. So if you are addicted to control, you are always slightly at war with the present. You are either trying to fix it, improve it, speed it up, or escape it. The mind becomes a constant editor, and editing life all day burns through attention like fire burns through dry leaves. Another toll of control addiction is that it creates constant self-surveillance. You start watching yourself like an enemy, monitoring your emotions, judging your reactions, trying to prevent yourself from being too much, trying to keep your image clean, trying to stay composed, trying to stay impressive, trying to never be caught vulnerable. That is exhausting, because vulnerability is not a mistake. It is a human state. But control addiction treats vulnerability like danger. So it tightens. And when it tightens, it blocks the natural release that keeps the nervous system healthy. This is where spirituality gets burned out. Not because you stop believing in something, but because your inner life becomes dry. Prayer becomes performance. Meditation becomes another task. Growth becomes another demand. You start trying to achieve peace instead of allowing it. You start trying to force surrender, which is impossible, and deep down you feel it. This controlling approach is not working, but the mind doesn't know another way, so it pushes harder. That is the paradox. The more you try to force certainty, the more uncertainty you create inside yourself. Because you're fighting a basic truth of life, change is guaranteed and control is limited. Buddhist reality training is not about becoming passive. It is about becoming aligned. The teachings don't say, do nothing. They say, stop demanding that life be different before you allow yourself to be at peace. This changes everything, because the moment you stop needing certainty to relax, your energy returns. Not because your problems disappear, but because your inner system stops wasting energy trying to eliminate all risk. A healthier relationship with control looks like this. You plan, but you don't panic when plans change. You take responsibility, but you don't confuse responsibility with total control. You act wisely, but you accept that outcomes are not fully yours. You prepare, but you also trust. Trust is the medicine for control addiction. Not blind trust, not fantasy. Trust in your capacity. Trust that you can handle disappointment without collapsing. Trust that you can adapt. Trust that you can recover. Trust that you can set boundaries. Trust that you can ask for help. Trust that you can survive uncertainty without gripping life like a hostage. When this trust grows, control addiction weakens. The mind no longer needs to overmanage because it no longer believes disaster is waiting around every corner. This is also why letting go can feel scary at first. If your identity has been built around being the one who holds everything together, surrender feels like losing yourself. But what you're really losing is a role that was costing you your life force. Surrender in Buddhist teaching is not giving up. It is giving up the war. It is dropping the argument with reality. It is releasing the belief that your safety depends on perfect outcomes. It is choosing peace first, then moving from that peace. You can feel the difference immediately. When you are in control addiction, your actions feel tight. You move with pressure. Even success feels stressful because you're already worried about maintaining it. When you move from acceptance, your actions feel cleaner. You do what you can, then you let life respond. The mind stays open, the body stays softer. Energy is not leaking through constant tension. This is how spiritual burnout begins to heal. Not through a big breakthrough, but through small releases. Allowing some uncertainty. Letting one thing be unfinished without punishment. Saying, "I don't know yet," without panic. Letting people have their opinions without trying to control them. Letting a day be imperfect without calling it a failure. Each time you do this, you teach your nervous system something important. You teach it that control is not the source of safety. Presence is. And when presence becomes your home, you stop trying to force life into certainty. You start meeting life as it is. You stop living like everything is a threat. You start living like you belong here. That is when exhaustion begins to lift in a way sleep alone never could. As the grip of control begins to loosen, another belief quietly steps forward, one that has been praised for so long it rarely gets questioned. The belief that if you are not struggling, you are not growing. That progress must feel hard, heavy, exhausting, almost painful. That ease is laziness and rest is weakness. Even after learning to release control, this belief keeps the body tense because it whispers that peace means you are falling behind. Many people carry this rule so deeply that they don't know how to move without pushing. They don't trust calm. They don't trust flow. They only trust effort they can feel in their bones. There is a form of exhaustion that comes not from resisting reality, but from forcing yourself forward even when force is no longer needed. It is the fatigue of believing that life must be wrestled into improvement, that every step must be earned through strain, that if something feels natural, it cannot be valuable. This belief often begins early. Praise comes for hard work, endurance, sacrifice, pushing through pain. Over time, struggle becomes associated with worth. If you are tired, you must be doing something right. If you are overwhelmed, you must be committed. If you are suffering, you must be growing. The mind builds an identity around this pattern until it becomes difficult to tell the difference between meaningful effort and unnecessary strain. Buddhist teachings challenge this idea in a subtle way. They don't deny that effort matters, but they distinguish between wise effort and forced effort. Wise effort moves with awareness, adjusting when resistance appears. Forced effort ignores signals from the body and mind, continuing even when the direction no longer makes sense. One nourishes energy, the other drains it. Constant pushing can stall growth because it narrows perception. When you are straining, your attention focuses only on the obstacle. You become less aware of alternative paths, creative solutions, or the possibility that the obstacle is not meant to be forced through. Tension reduces flexibility, both physically and mentally. Growth requires openness, but struggle tightens everything. There is also the issue of recovery. Muscles grow during rest, not during exertion alone. The same principle applies to emotional and mental development. Without periods of integration, the system becomes overloaded. You may continue moving, but progress becomes superficial because nothing has been fully absorbed. Struggle can also become addictive. The adrenaline of urgency, the sense of purpose that comes from battling something, the identity of being the one who perseveres. Letting go of struggle can feel like losing meaning, even if the struggle itself is harmful. So the mind unconsciously creates new battles to maintain that sense of identity. This is why some people achieve goals only to immediately create new pressure. They cannot sit with the result because stillness feels empty. Without struggle, they feel unsure of who they are. The nervous system has learned to associate intensity with aliveness. Constant pushing also masks underlying fear. Fear that if you slow down, unresolved emotions will surface. Fear that rest will reveal dissatisfaction with your path. Fear that without constant activity, you will have to face uncertainty. Struggle becomes a distraction from introspection. Another hidden cost is the loss of joy. When every action is treated as a step toward improvement, experiences lose their intrinsic value. Activities are evaluated only by how useful they are, not by how they feel. Life becomes a checklist instead of a journey. Even achievements feel hollow because they were approached as obligations rather than expressions of curiosity or passion. There is also the physical toll. Chronic overexertion disrupts sleep, digestion, and hormonal balance. The body interprets constant pressure as a signal that conditions are unsafe, which keeps stress responses active. Over time, this reduces resilience, making it harder to sustain the very effort you believe is necessary. Buddhism introduces the concept of the middle way, a path between indulgence and extreme austerity. This principle applies not only to material habits, but to effort itself. Growth does not require punishing yourself. It requires consistency, balanced with compassion. When effort is aligned with awareness, it becomes sustainable rather than draining. Flow states illustrate this balance. In flow, action feels effortless even though you are fully engaged. Time passes differently and energy increases rather than decreases. This state emerges not from forcing, but from aligning challenge with skill and presence. It shows that progress can occur without strain. Constant pushing can also prevent listening. When you are focused on moving forward at all costs, you may ignore signs that a different direction is needed. Life often communicates through subtle discomfort, curiosity, or intuition. Struggle drowns out these signals because it prioritizes speed over awareness. There is also the danger of equating movement with progress. Activity alone does not guarantee growth. You can repeat the same patterns for years without evolving if those patterns are not examined. Slowing down allows reflection, which transforms experience into wisdom. Relationships suffer under constant pressure as well. When you treat interactions as tasks or problems to solve, genuine connection fades. Others may feel like obstacles or responsibilities rather than companions. Growth that isolates you is incomplete because humans develop through connection as much as through achievement. Letting go of struggle does not mean abandoning discipline. It means redefining discipline as commitment to clarity rather than commitment to hardship. You still act, but you act from intention instead of compulsion. You choose effort when it serves you, not because you believe suffering is required. Trust plays a role here too. Trust that you do not need to force every outcome. Trust that some processes unfold naturally when given time. Seeds do not grow faster because you pull on them. Development often happens beneath the surface. invisible until it becomes undeniable. Rest becomes part of progress rather than a pause from it. During rest, the mind reorganizes information, the body repairs itself, and insights emerge that effort alone could not produce. Many breakthroughs occur during moments of relaxation, not during frantic activity. There is also a shift in motivation. When you release the belief that struggle equals growth, you begin to pursue what feels meaningful rather than what feels difficult. Motivation becomes intrinsic, driven by interest and purpose instead of pressure. This type of motivation is more sustainable because it replenishes energy rather than consuming it. Compassion toward yourself increases as well. You stop measuring your worth by how much you endure. You recognize that gentleness can be a form of strength. This reduces the internal criticism that often accompanies perfectionism. Over time, you may notice that your pace changes. Not slower in a negative sense, but steadier. You conserve energy for what truly matters instead of scattering it across constant battles. Decisions become clearer because they are not clouded by urgency. Peaceful effort also improves learning. When you are not stressed, the brain processes information more effectively. Creativity, memory, and problem-solving improve because cognitive resources are not diverted toward managing anxiety. You begin to see that struggle was never the goal. It was a byproduct of misunderstanding how growth works. True development involves challenge, but challenge does not require suffering. It requires engagement, curiosity, and willingness to adapt. As this understanding settles in, life feels less like a race and more like an unfolding path. You still move forward, but you no longer feel chased by invisible deadlines. There is space to breathe, to observe, to enjoy the process. Energy returns because you are no longer burning it to prove your dedication. You are using it to live. Progress becomes something you experience rather than something you fight for. And in that shift, you discover a quieter kind of strength, the strength of moving without forcing, of growing without breaking yourself, of trusting that life does not need to be wrestled into meaning, because meaning emerges when you stop trying to conquer every step. As the need to struggle begins to loosen and you stop forcing yourself forward just to feel worthy, another layer of tension quietly reveals itself. You may notice that even without constant pressure, something inside still feels tight. Not because life is demanding more, but because certain feelings have been held back for so long that they no longer know how to move. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from holding emotions in place, like trying to keep water from flowing downhill with your bare hands. Many people learn early that some emotions are unacceptable. Anger must be controlled, sadness must be hidden, fear must be denied, vulnerability must be masked. Over time, this creates a habit of emotional resistance. Instead of feeling what arises, the mind fights it, distracts from it, or replaces it with something more acceptable. On the surface, this looks like strength. Inside, it creates friction. Emotional friction occurs when a feeling is present but not allowed to move. The body registers the emotion, prepares to process it, but the mind interrupts the process. This interruption traps the energy of the emotion inside the system. The result is tension, restlessness, and a sense of pressure that has no clear cause. Emotions are not just thoughts. They are physical experiences involving hormones, nervous system responses, and changes in muscle tension. When you suppress an emotion, you are not eliminating it. You are interrupting a biological process that needs completion. The body holds the unfinished response, waiting for permission to release it. This is why suppressed emotions tend to intensify over time. They accumulate rather than dissipate. A small frustration ignored repeatedly can eventually erupt as disproportionate anger. Unacknowledged sadness can become numbness or depression. Fear pushed aside can turn into chronic anxiety because the body never received the signal that the threat has passed. Buddhist teachings emphasize mindful awareness of feelings without clinging or aversion. Allowing emotions to arise and pass naturally prevents them from solidifying into identity. When you fight an emotion, you give it more attention and therefore more power. When you observe it without resistance, it moves through more quickly. There is also a misconception that feeling emotions will make them stronger. In reality, avoidance prolongs them. A wave that is allowed to crest and fall dissipates faster than one repeatedly blocked. Emotional processing works similarly. Fully experiencing a feeling often shortens its lifespan because the body completes the cycle. Suppression also creates confusion because emotions carry information. Anger may signal a boundary violation. Sadness may indicate loss. Fear may highlight uncertainty. When you ignore these signals, you lose guidance that could help you respond more wisely. The emotion persists because its message has not been acknowledged. Physical symptoms often reflect this internal conflict. Headaches, stomach discomfort, muscle tightness, fatigue. The body expresses what the mind refuses to articulate. These sensations are not random. They are manifestations of unresolved emotional energy seeking release. Another effect of suppression is emotional leakage. When feelings are not processed directly, they emerge indirectly through irritability, passive aggression, withdrawal, or sudden mood shifts. You may not connect these reactions to their original cause, which makes them seem unpredictable. This unpredictability increases stress for both you and those around you. There is also a loss of emotional literacy. If you habitually push feelings away, you may struggle to identify them when they arise. Everything feels like a vague discomfort rather than a specific emotion. Without clarity, it becomes difficult to address the underlying need. Emotional suppression often stems from fear of judgment. Worry that expressing feelings will make you appear weak, unstable, or difficult. This fear leads to performance, presenting a controlled version of yourself while hiding authentic reactions. Maintaining this performance consumes energy because it requires constant monitoring. Cultural expectations reinforce this pattern. Many environments reward composure and discourage vulnerability. While emotional regulation is valuable, regulation is different from suppression. Regulation allows feelings while guiding behavior. Suppression denies the feeling altogether. There is also the belief that certain emotions are dangerous, that anger will lead to harm, sadness will never end, fear will paralyze you. These beliefs make the mind treat emotions as threats instead of experiences. The body responds by tightening further, amplifying discomfort. Mindfulness practices teach a different approach, noticing sensations associated with emotions, warmth in the chest, heaviness in the limbs, tension in the throat, naming the feeling gently without judgment. This shifts the brain from reactive mode to observational mode, reducing intensity. Breathing deeply during emotional activation helps the nervous system regulate. It signals that the body is safe enough to process rather than fight. Over time, this builds tolerance for discomfort, making it less overwhelming. Expression is another important component. Writing, speaking, crying, movement. These outlets allow emotional energy to move outward instead of remaining trapped. Expression does not need to be dramatic to be effective. Even quiet acknowledgement can initiate release. There is also healing in being witnessed. Sharing feelings with someone who listens without trying to fix or minimize them can reduce their intensity. Social connection reassures the nervous system that you are not alone, which lowers stress responses. Compassion toward yourself is essential during this process. Recognizing that suppression was once a coping strategy, not a personal failure. Appreciating that your system was trying to protect you from overwhelm, even if the method became limiting over time. Gradually, As you allow emotions to move, you may notice increased sensitivity. This is not weakness, it is the return of awareness. Feelings become clearer, responses more authentic. You regain access to joy as well, because the same openness that allows pain also allows pleasure. There is a sense of lightness that emerges when emotional friction decreases. The body no longer needs to hold tension against itself. Energy flows more freely because nothing is being blocked internally. You may also find that relationships improve. Authentic expression fosters understanding and reduces misunderstandings. Others feel more comfortable being genuine as well, creating deeper connection. Creativity often expands because emotions are a source of inspiration. When they are suppressed, imagination narrows. When they are allowed, new ideas and perspectives emerge naturally. There is also resilience in emotional flexibility. Instead of fearing feelings, you trust your ability to experience them and recover. This confidence reduces anxiety about future challenges because you know you can handle whatever arises. Over time, emotions lose their reputation as enemies. They become signals, guides, experiences that pass through rather than forces that define you. You stop trying to control them and start listening to them. Peace becomes more accessible because inner conflict decreases. You are no longer fighting parts of yourself. The energy that was spent on resistance becomes available for presence and engagement with life. And in that openness, exhaustion softens, not because life is always easy, but because you are no longer carrying the weight of unexpressed feeling. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable because it is allowed to move instead of being trapped inside. As you begin allowing emotions to move instead of trapping them inside, a different kind of fatigue becomes visible, one that has nothing to do with feelings themselves, but with the version of you that has been presented to the world. You may notice how tiring it is to stay on, to keep the mask steady, to make sure your reactions match what others expect rather than what you truly feel. There is a quiet strain that comes from being seen, but not fully known. Many people live with an unspoken agreement between their inner life and their outer behavior. The agreement says, "I will show only what is acceptable." This agreement may have formed in childhood, in environments where authenticity felt risky. Perhaps honesty was met with criticism, vulnerability with dismissal, individuality with pressure to conform. Over time, adapting became safer than expressing. The result is a performed self, a version of you that functions well in social spaces but does not fully represent who you are. Maintaining this version requires continuous energy because it involves monitoring words, tone, expressions, even posture. Every interaction becomes a small performance, and performances cannot relax completely while they are happening. This is why social exhaustion can occur even without conflict. You may spend time with others who are kind and supportive, yet still feel drained afterward. The fatigue comes from the effort of filtering yourself, not from the people themselves. The nervous system senses the gap between authenticity and presentation, and that gap consumes energy. Authenticity is not about revealing everything indiscriminately. It is about alignment between what you feel and what you express. When alignment is absent, tension builds. The body prepares for the possibility of being exposed, misunderstood, or rejected, which keeps it in a subtle state of alertness. Buddhist teachings emphasize non-self, the understanding that identity is fluid rather than fixed. Ironically, when you cling to a rigid persona to protect yourself, you become trapped by it. The role you created for safety becomes a cage that limits spontaneity and genuine connection. There is also fear behind this performance, fear that if people see the real you, they will withdraw approval, fear that authenticity will lead to conflict or isolation. This fear keeps the mask in place even when it is no longer necessary. The mind prioritizes belonging over truth because belonging once meant survival. Over time, performing a false self can blur your own awareness of who you are. Preferences become influenced by expectations. Opinions soften to avoid disagreement. Dreams are adjusted to fit practicality. You may start to feel disconnected from your own desires because you have been responding to external signals instead of internal ones. This disconnection leads to a sense of emptiness that is difficult to explain. Life may look stable on the outside, yet something feels missing. The missing element is the experience of being fully present as yourself without needing to edit. Authentic expression restores vitality because it removes the need for constant monitoring. When you speak honestly, your body relaxes because it no longer has to track inconsistencies. Conversations become easier because you are not calculating every response. Presence replaces performance. There is also freedom in allowing others to react naturally rather than trying to manage their perceptions. Not everyone will resonate with your authenticity, but those who do will connect more deeply. Relationships built on performance tend to remain surface level because they are based on a role rather than a person. Work environments often reinforce the pressure to perform. Professional roles require certain behaviors, which can be useful for cooperation but limiting if they become your only mode of expression. Without spaces where you can be unfiltered, identity becomes tied solely to function rather than humanity. Creative outlets can counterbalance this effect. Activities that allow spontaneous expression, art, music, writing, movement, reconnect you with aspects of yourself that are not defined by external expectations. These outlets reduce emotional pressure because they provide a place where authenticity is welcomed. There is also the courage of small honesty, saying what you truly think in low-risk situations, expressing preferences without apology, allowing moments of vulnerability instead of defaulting to composure. These small acts gradually reduce the gap between inner and outer life. Self-acceptance plays a crucial role here. When you judge parts of yourself harshly, you are more likely to hide them from others. Acceptance does not mean approval of every behavior, but acknowledgement of your humanity, recognizing that imperfections are part of being real rather than defects to conceal. The body responds quickly to authenticity. Breathing deepens, posture becomes natural, facial muscles soften. These physical changes signal safety to the nervous system because there is no longer a need to guard against exposure. Over time, you may discover that authenticity attracts rather than repels. People are drawn to genuine presence because it feels safe and relatable. When one person stops performing, others often feel permission to do the same, creating more honest interactions. There is also a reduction in anxiety. Performance requires anticipation of reactions, which keeps the mind busy predicting outcomes. Authenticity removes much of this anticipation because you are focused on expression rather than approval. The fear of rejection may still appear occasionally, but it becomes manageable because your sense of worth is no longer dependent solely on others' responses. You begin to value alignment with yourself as much as acceptance from others. Living authentically also clarifies decision-making. Choices become guided by internal values rather than external pressure. This reduces regret because actions reflect who you are instead of who you felt obligated to be. Energy returns as the silent effort of performance disappears. Tasks feel lighter because you are not carrying an additional layer of self-monitoring. Even solitude becomes more comfortable because you are no longer escaping from a persona that feels foreign. There is a deeper peace in knowing that you do not have to remember which version of yourself you presented to whom. Consistency replaces fragmentation. Your identity becomes coherent rather than divided into roles. Authenticity also enhances resilience. When you accept yourself, criticism loses some of its sting because it does not threaten your core identity. You can evaluate feedback without feeling attacked because you are not defending a fragile persona. Spiritual traditions often emphasize truthfulness not only as a moral principle, but as a path to inner harmony. When words, thoughts, and actions align, internal conflict decreases. This harmony feels like stability, a grounded sense of being at home in yourself. As the need to perform fades, curiosity returns. You explore interests without worrying about how they will be perceived. You allow yourself to change without feeling inconsistent. Growth becomes natural rather than forced. Joy also becomes more accessible because you are not filtering experiences through a lens of image management. Laughter feels freer. Affection feels warmer. Silence feels comfortable instead of awkward. The exhaustion that once seemed unavoidable begins to dissolve. Not because life became easier, but because you stopped carrying the weight of pretending. The energy that was spent maintaining appearances becomes available for living fully. And in that openness you realize something quietly powerful. Being yourself is not a risk to survive, but a relief to experience. The self you once hid is not a liability, but a source of vitality. When authenticity replaces performance, life no longer feels like a stage. It feels like a place where you can finally rest while still being seen. As the pressure to perform begins to fall away and you start living with more honesty, something else becomes easier to notice. A voice inside that is never fully satisfied, never fully at peace, always searching for something to oppose. Even when life is calm, this voice finds something to criticize, something to defend against, something to prove. It feels restless in silence, almost uncomfortable when there is nothing to fight. There is a strange tension that appears when peace arrives, but part of you doesn't trust it. This is where the ego quietly reveals its survival strategy. The ego is not evil or malicious. It is a structure built to protect identity. It forms from memories, beliefs, roles, and comparisons. Over time, it learns that conflict strengthens its sense of existence. When there is an enemy, a problem, a challenge, or a narrative of struggle, the ego feels solid. Without those things, it begins to feel uncertain, as if it might dissolve. The ego survives by creating separation. It divides the world into categories: right and wrong, success and failure, superior and inferior, us and them. These divisions provide a framework for identity. If something threatens that framework, the ego reacts defensively because its sense of self depends on maintaining those distinctions. Conflict feeds the ego because it reinforces boundaries. When you argue, defend, justify, or compare, you are affirming a position. That position becomes part of who you believe you are. Peace, on the other hand, softens boundaries. It blurs the lines that define identity, which can feel unsettling if you are used to defining yourself through opposition. This is why some people feel energized by drama. The emotional intensity creates a sense of aliveness that calmness does not provide. Without conflict, they may feel empty or directionless because they have not learned how to exist without something to push against. Buddhist teachings describe the ego as a collection of attachments rather than a fixed entity. It clings to stories about who you are, what you deserve, and how life should treat you. When reality contradicts these stories, the ego interprets it as a threat rather than a neutral event. Resistance arises not because the situation is unbearable, but because it challenges the narrative. One of the ego's most powerful tools is personalization. Events are interpreted as happening to you rather than simply happening. A delayed response becomes rejection. A disagreement becomes disrespect. A setback becomes proof of inadequacy. By framing experiences this way, the ego keeps itself at the center of everything. This constant personalization creates emotional turbulence. You become reactive because each event feels like a statement about your worth or identity. The nervous system remains alert, scanning for signs of threat, even in ordinary situations. The ego also relies on comparison to maintain stability. Measuring yourself against others provides a reference point that reinforces identity. If you are ahead, you feel superior. If you are behind, you feel inferior. Either way, comparison keeps attention focused outward, preventing the deeper question of who you are without those measurements. There is also the need to be right. Being right validates the ego's perspective, while being wrong feels like erosion of identity. This can make it difficult to admit mistakes or change beliefs, even when new information is available. The goal shifts from understanding to defending. Control is another strategy. By trying to manage outcomes and perceptions, the ego attempts to reduce uncertainty. However, life's unpredictability ensures that control is never complete, which perpetuates frustration and anxiety. Peace threatens the ego because it removes the conditions that sustain these patterns. Without conflict, comparison, or control struggles, the ego has fewer opportunities to reinforce itself. This can create a sense of groundlessness, as if something familiar has disappeared. Yet this groundlessness is not danger, it is openness. It is the space where identity becomes flexible rather than rigid. In this space, you can respond to situations instead of reacting from conditioned patterns. Mindfulness practices weaken the ego's hold by shifting attention from narratives to direct experience. Instead of analyzing why something happened or what it means about you, you notice sensations, thoughts, and feelings as they arise. This reduces identification with them. Compassion also softens ego defenses. When you extend understanding toward yourself and others, the need to categorize diminishes. You recognize shared vulnerability rather than focusing on differences. There is freedom in letting experiences exist without turning them into stories about self-worth. A failure becomes an event to learn from rather than evidence of inadequacy. Praise becomes a pleasant experience rather than proof of superiority. Silence can be challenging because it deprives the ego of stimulation. Without conversation, tasks, or distractions, unresolved thoughts surface. This is why many people avoid stillness, not because silence is uncomfortable in itself, but because it exposes the mind's activity. As you become comfortable with stillness, you notice that thoughts come and go without needing to be followed. Identity loosens because you see that you are not every thought that appears. This realization reduces the urgency to defend or assert yourself. Relationships change as well. When you are less invested in being right or superior, interactions become more collaborative. Listening becomes easier because you are not preparing counter-arguments. Empathy grows because you are not filtering everything through personal relevance. There is also a reduction in resentment. When you stop viewing life as something that should align perfectly with your expectations, disappointments lose some of their sting. You recognize that unpredictability is not personal. The ego's habit of declaring war on reality often stems from fear of insignificance. Conflict provides a sense of importance. Letting go of conflict can feel like fading into the background. However, true presence does not require intensity to exist. Quiet awareness is just as real as dramatic engagement. Over time, peace becomes less threatening. You begin to appreciate the stability it offers. Energy that was once spent on maintaining identity becomes available for creativity, connection, and exploration. There is also humility in recognizing that you do not need to define yourself constantly. Identity can be fluid, adapting to circumstances without losing integrity. This flexibility reduces stress because you are not forcing consistency at all costs. Acceptance does not mean passivity. You still act, express preferences, and set boundaries. The difference is that these actions come from clarity rather than defense. You are responding to the situation, not protecting an image. Gratitude naturally increases as conflict decreases. Without the noise of dissatisfaction, ordinary experiences regain their richness. Small moments become meaningful because they are no longer overshadowed by internal battles. Joy also becomes quieter but deeper. It is not dependent on victory or validation. It arises from alignment with reality rather than triumph over it. In this state, life feels less like a battlefield and more like a landscape to explore. Challenges still appear, but they are approached with curiosity instead of hostility. Problems become puzzles rather than threats. The exhaustion that once came from constant tension begins to fade. You are no longer bracing against everything that doesn't match your expectations. Muscles relax, breathing slows, attention widens, and in that openness, you realize something unexpected. The ego's war was never protecting you from reality. It was protecting itself from disappearing. When the need for conflict dissolves, what remains is not emptiness, but peace, a quiet strength that does not need to prove its existence because it simply is. As the inner war begins to quiet and the need to fight reality loosens its grip, something even more subtle starts to reveal itself. Not the loud resistance that once defined your struggle, but the quiet friction woven into ordinary moments. A sigh when something takes too long, a flash of irritation at a small inconvenience, a silent complaint that life should be moving faster, smoother, easier. These moments feel insignificant, almost too small to matter, yet they leave you strangely tired by the end of the day. There is a kind of resistance so ordinary that it becomes invisible. It lives in the tiny no whispered inside your mind throughout the day. No to the traffic, no to the noise, no to the weather, no to the slow internet, no to the person speaking too long, no to the task you didn't want to do. Each refusal is brief, but together they create a constant current of tension running beneath everything you experience. This is micro-resistance, not a dramatic rejection of reality, but a steady stream of subtle opposition to what is already happening. The body responds to each of these moments, even if you barely notice them. Muscles tighten slightly, breathing becomes shallow, the jaw hardens, shoulders lift. These changes are small, but they accumulate. By evening you may feel drained without understanding why, because no single event seems significant enough to explain the exhaustion. Micro-resistance is powerful precisely because it is continuous. Major stresses come and go, allowing recovery afterward. Tiny irritations repeat endlessly, preventing the nervous system from fully settling. It is like background noise that never stops, making deep rest difficult even during quiet moments. Impatience is one of its most common forms. The belief that things should move at the speed you prefer creates friction whenever they do not. Waiting in line becomes a struggle instead of a neutral pause. Delays feel like personal offenses rather than natural variations in timing. This impatience keeps the mind in a state of urgency that the body experiences as stress. Complaint is another expression, not always spoken aloud, often internal. A running commentary about what is wrong, unfair, inefficient, annoying. Complaining may feel like release, but it often reinforces dissatisfaction because attention remains fixed on what is unwanted. The brain strengthens pathways associated with negativity, making irritation easier to access next time. Subtle comparison also fuels micro-resistance. Seeing someone else's situation and wishing yours were different creates a quiet rejection of your own experience. Even pleasant moments can feel insufficient if they are measured against an imagined alternative. There is also resistance to discomfort, even mild discomfort, heat, cold, hunger, boredom, fatigue. When these sensations are treated as problems rather than temporary experiences, the mind reacts with tension. Acceptance would allow them to pass more easily, but resistance prolongs awareness of them. Micro-resistance often stems from expectations, unspoken rules about how life should unfold. When reality diverges from these rules, even slightly, frustration appears. The more rigid the expectations, the more frequent the friction. Technology has amplified this pattern by reducing tolerance for delay. Instant access to information, communication, and entertainment conditions the mind to expect immediate results. When something requires patience, it feels abnormal, even though waiting has always been part of human experience. Mindfulness brings these patterns into awareness, noticing the moment irritation arises without immediately acting on it. Observing the physical sensations associated with resistance, recognizing that the discomfort comes from opposition rather than the situation itself. Breathing slowly during these moments can interrupt the cycle. It signals to the nervous system that there is no urgent threat, allowing tension to release. Over time, this practice increases tolerance for inconvenience. Gratitude shifts attention toward what is present rather than what is missing. Acknowledging simple aspects of the moment, shelter, safety, the ability to perceive, counterbalances the tendency to focus on flaws. This does not deny challenges, but broadens perspective. Humor can also dissolve micro-resistance. Seeing the absurdity in minor frustrations reduces their emotional charge. Laughter relaxes the body and interrupts repetitive thought patterns. There is freedom in accepting that not every discomfort requires correction. Some experiences can simply be allowed. The noise, the delay, the imperfection. Acceptance does not mean preference. It means choosing not to fight what cannot be changed in that moment. Slowing down intentionally counters the habit of urgency. Moving at a pace that allows awareness of surroundings rather than rushing past everything. This creates space for appreciation and reduces the pressure that fuels impatience. Nature offers lessons in patience. Seasons change gradually, not on demand. Growth occurs at its own rhythm. Observing these processes can recalibrate expectations about speed and control. Micro-resistance also affects relationships. Small irritations toward others, if unexamined, accumulate into resentment. Addressing them early through communication or perspective-taking prevents escalation. Compassion toward yourself is important as well. Recognizing that resistance often arises from fatigue or unmet needs. Instead of criticizing yourself for impatience, consider whether rest, nourishment, or emotional support is needed. Rest becomes deeper when micro-resistance decreases because the mind is not replaying minor grievances. Sleep improves as the nervous system spends more time in a relaxed state during the day. Energy returns because it is no longer spent on constant opposition. Tasks feel lighter because you are not carrying extra tension. Creativity increases because attention is not consumed by irritation. You may notice that moments previously overlooked become pleasant. The warmth of sunlight, the rhythm of walking, the sound of laughter. These experiences were always available, but resistance blocked awareness of them. Peace emerges not from eliminating all inconvenience, but from reducing the habit of rejecting it. Life continues to include unpredictability and imperfection, yet it no longer feels like a series of obstacles. There is also humility in accepting that the world does not revolve around personal preference. This humility reduces entitlement and increases appreciation for what unfolds naturally. Over time, patience becomes a default rather than an effort. Waiting feels neutral instead of stressful. Minor setbacks are absorbed without disruption. The mind becomes more flexible, adapting instead of resisting. This flexibility enhances resilience. When larger challenges appear, you are less depleted because your energy has not been drained by countless small battles. You have reserves available for what truly matters. Joy becomes quieter but more frequent. Not dependent on ideal conditions, but arising from presence. Satisfaction grows because you are no longer measuring each moment against an imagined better one. And in this gentle shift, you discover that exhaustion was never only about major struggles. It was also about the tiny refusals scattered throughout the day. When those refusals soften into acceptance, life does not become perfect, but it becomes lighter. The background tension fades, replaced by a steady calm that carries you forward without draining you. The energy that once leaked through subtle resistance returns as clarity, patience, and ease. What remains is not dramatic transformation, but a quiet restoration, the feeling of moving through the day without constantly pushing against it. As the small daily resistances begin to loosen and you notice how much energy was hidden inside tiny moments of tension, a deeper belief starts to surface. Even as life feels lighter, part of the mind becomes suspicious of that ease. It whispers that relaxing means giving up, that calm means you are falling behind, that acceptance is another word for surrender in the worst sense. Peace starts to feel unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, as if something important is being neglected. This reaction does not come from weakness, it comes from conditioning. For many people, effort and struggle were praised while stillness was questioned. You were taught that success requires constant pushing, that rest must be earned, that satisfaction should always be temporary, so you keep striving. Over time, this training shaped the way your mind interprets calmness. Instead of seeing it as balance, it sees it as danger. Acceptance feels like failure to the conditioned mind because it confuses acceptance with resignation. Resignation is passive and hopeless, a belief that nothing can change. Acceptance is clear and grounded, an acknowledgement of reality as it is right now. These are completely different states, yet the mind often blends them together because both involve stopping resistance. The conditioned mind is built on comparison and competition. It evaluates worth based on achievement, status, and progress. When you stop pushing for more, it assumes you are losing ground. This creates anxiety whenever you slow down, even if slowing down is what your body and emotions need. There is also fear that acceptance will erase ambition, that if you become content, you will stop growing. This belief ignores the fact that growth fueled by anxiety is unstable, while growth supported by clarity is sustainable. When you accept your current situation, you are not locking yourself in place. You are removing the distortion created by resistance so you can see your options more clearly. Peace challenges identity as well. If you have defined yourself as someone who overcomes obstacles through relentless effort, letting go of struggle can feel like losing part of who you are. The ego wonders who you will be without the story of constant striving. Many cultures reinforce the idea that busyness equals value. Being calm can be misinterpreted as laziness. People who move slowly or speak gently may be seen as lacking drive, even when they are deeply engaged with life. This social pressure makes acceptance feel risky because it might invite judgment. Buddhist teachings emphasize that acceptance is the foundation of wise action. When you stop denying reality, you can respond to it effectively. Denial wastes energy because it keeps you focused on how things should be rather than how they are. Acceptance redirects that energy toward meaningful change. Acceptance also restores choice. When you resist, reactions become automatic because you are operating from tension. When you accept, you create space between stimulus and response. In that space, you can decide what truly matters instead of reacting from habit. There is a paradox here. Acceptance does not weaken motivation, it purifies it. Instead of acting from fear or insecurity, you act from intention. Goals become expressions of curiosity or purpose rather than attempts to prove worth. The body responds positively to acceptance. Muscles relax, breathing deepens, digestion improves. These changes support clearer thinking and emotional stability. Resistance keeps the body in a state of readiness that consumes resources needed for creativity and healing. Acceptance also improves relationships. When you stop trying to control others' behavior to fit your expectations, interactions become less tense. You listen more, judge less, and allow people to be themselves. This reduces conflict and fosters trust. Forgiveness becomes possible through acceptance. Holding on to resentment requires maintaining a narrative about how things should have been. Acceptance acknowledges that the past cannot be altered, freeing you from the burden of replaying it. There is also freedom from perfectionism. Acceptance allows mistakes to exist without turning them into evidence of failure. You can learn from them without self-punishment. This encourages experimentation and growth because fear of error decreases. Mindfulness practices strengthen acceptance by training attention to remain with present experience rather than escaping into judgment. Observing sensations, thoughts, and emotions without labeling them as good or bad gradually shifts the brain toward neutrality. Gratitude often follows acceptance. When you stop comparing reality to idealized versions, you notice what is already supportive or beautiful. Appreciation arises naturally rather than being forced. Stillness becomes restorative instead of threatening. Silence is no longer filled with worry about lost time. It becomes a place where insight emerges and energy replenishes. Acceptance also changes the perception of uncertainty. Instead of seeing unpredictability as a threat, you recognize it as an inherent aspect of life. This reduces anxiety about controlling the future because you accept that control is limited. Confidence grows because you trust your ability to handle whatever arises rather than relying on rigid plans. Flexibility replaces rigidity, making adaptation easier when circumstances shift. There is also humility in acceptance. Recognizing that life is larger than personal preferences reduces the pressure to manage everything. You participate in reality rather than trying to dominate it. As acceptance deepens, the conditioned mind begins to relax its alarms. It learns that peace does not erase progress. In fact, progress often becomes more visible when noise subsides. Joy becomes quieter but more stable. It does not depend on achievements or validation. It arises from alignment with the present moment. Creativity flourishes because mental resources are no longer consumed by resistance. Ideas emerge spontaneously when the mind is calm enough to notice them. Energy increases because you are not draining it through constant tension. Tasks that once felt heavy become manageable. Rest feels effective rather than guilty. You may also discover that acceptance enhances discipline. When actions are not driven by fear, you can commit to them consistently without burnout. Discipline becomes an act of care rather than punishment. The belief that peace equals passivity gradually dissolves. You see that calmness allows precise action, like a still surface reflecting clearly. Turbulence distorts perception, leading to impulsive decisions. Over time, acceptance becomes a quiet strength. It does not announce itself or demand recognition. It simply supports everything you do with steadiness. Life begins to feel less like a race and more like a rhythm. Effort and rest alternate naturally. Engagement and reflection coexist without conflict. And in that balance, exhaustion fades into a gentle alertness. You are awake to your experience without being overwhelmed by it. The conditioned mind, once suspicious of peace, learns that calm is not the end of growth, but the ground from which growth can truly begin. As acceptance begins to soften the conditioned fear of peace, another hidden weight becomes easier to feel. You may notice how often your body stays guarded even when there is no immediate danger. A tightness in the chest during simple conversations. A readiness to defend yourself before anyone has attacked. A subtle alertness that never fully switches off, as if you're waiting for something to go wrong. Calm may be present, yet part of you remains braced, unable to trust that it will last. This is the burden of psychological armor, the invisible protection you carry to prevent pain, rejection, embarrassment, or betrayal. It forms gradually, usually after experiences that made openness feel unsafe, criticism that cut too deep, trust that was broken. moments when vulnerability was used against you. The mind learns from these events and decides that constant readiness is safer than relaxation. At first, this armor serves a purpose. It helps you function in environments where you feel exposed. It filters what you say, how you act, and how much you reveal. Over time, however, what once protected you begins to confine you. The same shield that blocks harm also blocks connection, spontaneity, and ease. Psychological armor operates through defensiveness, interpreting neutral comments as potential attacks, preparing explanations before they are needed, justifying choices even when no one is questioning them. This constant anticipation of conflict drains energy because the nervous system remains in a state of vigilance. The body mirrors this state. Shoulders lift slightly, breathing becomes shallow, the jaw stays tense. These physical patterns may feel normal because they have been present for so long, but they consume energy continuously. Muscles that never fully relax require more effort to maintain. Defensiveness also affects perception. When you expect threat, you are more likely to notice signs that confirm that expectation. A distracted expression becomes disapproval. Silence becomes judgment. Delayed responses become rejection. This bias reinforces the belief that armor is necessary, even when the environment is relatively safe. Buddhist teachings highlight the concept of suffering created by clinging. In this case, clinging to protection. Holding tightly to the idea that you must always guard yourself prevents you from experiencing the freedom of openness. It keeps you oriented toward past pain rather than present reality. Psychological armor often includes emotional distance, keeping conversations surface level, avoiding topics that feel personal, maintaining a controlled demeanor. While this reduces the risk of exposure, it also limits intimacy. Others may sense the barrier without understanding its origin, leading to misunderstandings or feelings of disconnect. Trust becomes difficult because armor assumes danger. Even positive experiences may be questioned, analyzed for hidden motives. This skepticism protects against disappointment but prevents genuine reassurance from taking root. Carrying armor also interferes with self-awareness. When you focus on monitoring external threats, you have less attention available for internal experience. Emotions may be suppressed or ignored because acknowledging them would require lowering defenses. There is also the exhaustion of constant self-control, monitoring tone, facial expressions, and reactions to avoid appearing weak. This performance resembles the false self discussed earlier, but is driven specifically by fear of harm rather than desire for approval. Healing begins with recognizing that not all situations require the same level of protection. Distinguishing between past and present reduces automatic reactions. Asking whether the current environment truly resembles the one that created the armor can interrupt habitual defensiveness. Mindfulness helps by bringing attention to physical sensations associated with guarding. Noticing tightness, shallow breathing, or restlessness without immediately trying to change them. Awareness itself can initiate relaxation because it shifts the brain from threat detection to observation. Gradual exposure to vulnerability rebuilds tolerance. Sharing small truths with trusted individuals, allowing moments of uncertainty without rushing to defend, accepting support when offered. These experiences teach the nervous system that openness does not always lead to pain. Self-compassion is essential because armor was created for survival. Criticizing yourself for being guarded only adds another layer of tension. Acknowledging the intelligence of your past coping strategies allows them to soften without resistance. Boundaries differ from armor. Boundaries are flexible and intentional, adjusted according to context. Armor is rigid and automatic, applied everywhere, regardless of necessity. Learning this distinction allows you to protect yourself without isolating yourself. Rest becomes deeper when armor loosens. Sleep improves because the body is not preparing for imaginary threats. Energy returns because resources are no longer spent on constant vigilance. Creativity expands as well. Openness allows new ideas and perspectives to enter without being filtered through suspicion. Curiosity replaces defensiveness, making learning more enjoyable. Relationships benefit from reduced guarding. Conversations become more relaxed. Misunderstandings decrease. Affection feels natural rather than risky. Others respond to openness with openness, creating mutual safety. There is also relief in not having to maintain a perfect image. Admitting uncertainty or mistakes no longer feels dangerous. Humility becomes comfortable because identity is not tied to invulnerability. Forgiveness toward yourself and others becomes possible because armor often includes resentment as reinforcement. Letting go of past grievances removes some of the justification for staying guarded. Physical relaxation follows emotional relaxation. Posture softens, breathing deepens, movement becomes fluid. These changes signal to the brain that conditions are safe, creating a feedback loop that reinforces calmness. Silence feels different without armor. Instead of scanning for danger, you experience stillness as rest. Solitude becomes nourishing rather than lonely. Confidence shifts from defensive to grounded. Instead of proving strength through toughness, you feel strong through stability. You know you can handle discomfort without needing to preempt it. There is also a sense of spaciousness. Without constant tension, awareness widens. You notice details previously overlooked, colors, sounds, subtle expressions. Presence becomes richer. Life feels less like a battlefield and more like a place where connection is possible. Challenges still arise, but they are approached with clarity rather than fear. Over time, armor transforms into wisdom. You retain the ability to protect yourself when necessary, but you no longer assume danger by default. Protection becomes a tool rather than a prison. Exhaustion fades because you are no longer carrying the weight of constant readiness. The energy that once sustained vigilance becomes available for engagement, creativity, and joy. And in that quiet release, you discover that safety was never only about defending yourself. It was also about allowing yourself to live without expecting harm at every turn. When the armor loosens, life touches you more directly, not as a threat, but as an experience you are finally free to feel without bracing against it. As the armor begins to loosen and you realize how much energy was spent bracing against life, another tension quietly comes into view. The effort to hold things still in a world that never stops moving. Even when you feel safer and more open, there can be a deep unease when something changes, fades, or ends. A relationship shifts, a phase of life closes, a familiar routine disappears. Part of you wants to pause time, to freeze what feels comfortable so you don't have to face the uncertainty of what comes next. There is a quiet grief in watching something you love transform into something you don't recognize. This is the resistance to impermanence, the attempt to keep life from flowing as it naturally does. Impermanence is not only about loss, it is about constant change. Seasons turning, bodies aging, emotions rising and falling, circumstances evolving. Nothing remains fixed, yet the mind often insists that stability should be permanent. Clinging forms when you try to secure what was never meant to stay unchanged. It can be attachment to people, roles, identities, achievements, or even suffering. The mind holds tightly because it equates familiarity with safety. Change feels like a threat because it removes the reference points that made life predictable. Buddhist teachings place impermanence at the center of understanding suffering. The pain does not come from change itself, but from resisting it. When you demand permanence from what is inherently temporary, you create tension between expectation and reality. This tension manifests as anxiety, grief, or anger. Clinging also narrows perception. You focus on preserving what is slipping away instead of noticing what is emerging. Opportunities remain unseen because attention is fixed on what is ending. Life continues to unfold, but resistance keeps you anchored to the past. There is also fear of identity loss. If you have defined yourself by a role or achievement, change can feel like erasure. Retirement, relocation, the end of a relationship, or shifts in health challenge the story you tell about who you are. Without that story, you may feel disoriented, unsure of how to navigate the new landscape. Impermanence affects not only major life events but everyday experiences. A pleasant moment ends, a conversation concludes, a meal is finished. The mind may grasp at these experiences, wishing they could last longer, which diminishes enjoyment while they are happening. Acceptance of impermanence allows appreciation without desperation. When you know something will pass, you become more present with it instead of taking it for granted. Awareness of transience sharpens attention, making experiences vivid. Grief becomes healthier when impermanence is acknowledged. Instead of resisting the reality of loss, you allow sadness to move through naturally. This does not eliminate pain, but it prevents it from turning into bitterness or denial. Nature reflects impermanence constantly. Leaves fall, tides shift, weather changes. Observing these cycles can normalize transformation rather than treating it as abnormal. You see that renewal follows decay, growth follows dormancy. Mindfulness practices train the mind to observe change moment by moment. Sensations in the body shift, sounds appear and fade, thoughts arise and dissolve. This direct experience reduces attachment to any single state, because you witness its instability. There is also freedom in letting go of control over timing. Many people suffer not only because things change, but because they change sooner or later than expected. Releasing rigid timelines reduces frustration. Impermanence also softens conflict. When you realize that moods, opinions, and circumstances evolve, disagreements lose some intensity. You understand that what feels permanent today may look different tomorrow. Relationships deepen through acceptance of change. You allow others to grow without demanding consistency with past versions of themselves. This creates space for authenticity rather than forcing them into outdated roles. Clinging to pain can be as strong as clinging to pleasure. Familiar suffering may feel safer than unknown relief because it is predictable. Letting go requires trusting that life can hold you even without the patterns you know. Resisting impermanence often leads to hoarding, not only objects, but memories and expectations. You try to preserve evidence of what once was, hoping it will anchor you. Yet this accumulation can become a burden, reminding you of what has changed instead of helping you move forward. There is also the illusion that happiness lies in securing permanence. Achievements, possessions, status are pursued as if they will stabilize life. When they inevitably change, disappointment follows because the promise of lasting satisfaction was unrealistic. Acceptance of impermanence encourages flexibility. Plans become adaptable rather than rigid. You respond to circumstances instead of forcing them to match preconceived ideas. Creativity thrives in change. New situations require new solutions, perspectives, and skills. When you stop fearing transformation, curiosity replaces anxiety. There is humility in recognizing that control is limited. You participate in life's unfolding rather than directing it entirely. This humility reduces pressure because you are not responsible for maintaining everything. Time becomes more meaningful when you accept that it cannot be paused. You invest attention where it matters instead of postponing connection or joy. Forgiveness becomes easier because you understand that people are shaped by changing conditions. You release the expectation that anyone, including yourself, should be fixed and unchanging. Aging illustrates impermanence vividly. Instead of viewing it as decline, you can see it as evolution. Different abilities emerge, different priorities take shape. Acceptance reduces fear of the future. Impermanence also reveals the preciousness of ordinary experiences. A conversation with a friend, a quiet evening, a familiar place. Knowing they will not exist forever encourages gratitude. Letting go does not mean detachment in a cold sense. It means loving without demanding ownership. You care deeply while recognizing that nothing can be possessed permanently. There is also resilience in accepting change. When you stop resisting, transitions become less shocking because you expect movement rather than stability. Peace emerges from flowing with life instead of bracing against it. You adapt like water, finding paths around obstacles rather than trying to remove them entirely. Energy returns because you are not spending it on holding things in place. The effort of clinging is replaced by the ease of movement. You may notice a sense of lightness, as if a weight has been lifted. Without the need to secure permanence, experiences can come and go without leaving residue. Life begins to feel like a series of waves rather than a fixed landscape. You ride them instead of trying to stop them, trusting that balance is possible even as conditions shift. And in that surrender to movement, you discover that impermanence was never the enemy. It was the force that makes renewal possible, the reason growth exists, the reason new connections and opportunities appear. When you stop fighting the natural flow, exhaustion gives way to a quiet vitality, the feeling of being carried by life rather than dragging against it. As you begin to flow more gently with change and stop gripping life so tightly, another hidden drain starts to surface. Not in the outer world, but in the quiet theater of the mind. Even when nothing is happening, conversations replay, words you wish you had said, responses you plan for situations that may never occur, scenes of conflict that feel real enough to raise your heartbeat, even though you are alone in a silent room. It is exhausting to fight battles that only exist in thought. The mind often rehearses arguments as a way of protecting itself. It tries to prepare for possible confrontations by simulating them in advance. At first, this seems useful, even responsible. Preparation feels like control, but these mental rehearsals rarely end in resolution. Instead, they loop, repeating the same lines with slight variations, each time reinforcing tension rather than releasing it. Imaginary arguments trigger real physiological responses. The body does not distinguish clearly between an actual confrontation and a vividly imagined one. Stress hormones increase, muscles tighten, breathing changes. You may feel restless or fatigued afterward without understanding that your body just went through a simulated conflict. These rehearsals often arise from unresolved emotions, anger that was never expressed, hurt that was never acknowledged, fear of being misunderstood. The mind tries to complete unfinished conversations internally because there was no safe space to complete them externally. There is also the desire to be understood. Imaginary arguments allow you to say everything you wish the other person could hear. In these mental dialogues, you finally explain yourself perfectly. You win the exchange, you feel validated. But when the scenario ends, reality remains unchanged, and the cycle begins again. Perfectionism fuels this pattern. The need to have the right response for every situation creates pressure to anticipate criticism. You search for the perfect words that will prevent misunderstanding or rejection. This search never ends because human interactions are unpredictable. Rumination plays a role as well. Replaying past conversations to analyze what went wrong or how you could have acted differently. While reflection can be helpful, rumination keeps attention trapped in the past, draining energy needed for the present. The mind's negativity bias amplifies conflict scenarios because threats are prioritized over neutral or positive experiences. A single uncomfortable interaction can occupy hours of mental space, overshadowing many pleasant moments. Buddhist teachings emphasize observing thoughts without attachment, recognizing that thoughts are events in the mind, not commands or realities. When you stop identifying with every thought, imaginary arguments lose their grip because they are no longer fueled by belief. Mindfulness interrupts rehearsal loops by returning attention to sensory experience, the feeling of the breath, the sound of the environment, the contact of your body with the ground. These anchors bring you back from imagined scenarios to actual presence. There is also healing in acknowledging what the arguments represent. Often they are not about winning, but about needing closure, validation, or safety. Identifying the underlying need allows you to address it directly rather than through endless mental debate. Writing thoughts down can externalize them, reducing the need to hold them internally. Seeing them on paper often reveals repetition and exaggeration that were less obvious in the mind. Forgiveness toward yourself and others reduces the emotional charge that sustains these rehearsals. Letting go of the need for perfect resolution allows conversations to remain unfinished without continuing to consume energy. Acceptance that not everyone will understand you frees you from trying to craft the perfect explanation. You can communicate honestly without needing universal agreement. Silence becomes restorative when mental arguments quiet. The absence of internal dialogue allows deeper relaxation than physical rest alone. Imaginary conflicts also affect relationships. When you expect hostility based on rehearsed scenarios, you may approach interactions defensively, which can create tension that would not have existed otherwise. Letting go of rehearsal does not mean neglecting preparation for important conversations. It means preparing intentionally rather than compulsively. Setting aside specific time to think through what you want to express, then releasing it instead of revisiting it repeatedly. There is also value in accepting uncertainty. Conversations rarely unfold exactly as imagined. Trusting your ability to respond in the moment reduces the need for exhaustive mental scripting. Self-compassion helps because imaginary arguments often involve harsh self-judgment. Recognizing that everyone struggles with communication at times softens the pressure to perform perfectly. Physical movement can release built-up tension from mental activity. Walking, stretching, or breathing exercises shift the body out of stress mode, making it easier for the mind to settle. Creative activities redirect attention toward constructive expression. Painting, music, or crafting provide an outlet for emotional energy that might otherwise fuel rumination. Over time, you may notice that the urge to rehearse decreases as unresolved feelings are processed and confidence in your communication grows. Energy returns because it is no longer spent on endless mental conflict. You feel more present, less distracted, more capable of engaging with real experiences. Clarity improves because attention is not fragmented by imaginary scenarios. Decisions become easier when the mind is not crowded with hypothetical debates. Peace emerges not from solving every imagined problem, but from recognizing that most of them do not require solutions. You begin to trust that you can handle conversations as they happen, without rehearsing every possibility. This trust reduces anxiety and increases spontaneity. Joy becomes accessible again because mental space is available for appreciation rather than defense. Sleep improves because the mind is not replaying arguments when you lie down. Rest becomes genuine rather than superficial. Relationships benefit from your calmer presence. Others feel less tension and respond more openly, creating a positive feedback loop. And in this quiet release, you realize that the exhaustion was not from life itself, but from the battles you fought alone in your head. When those battles fade, you experience a deeper kind of rest, not just the absence of activity, but the absence of internal warfare. A calm awareness that allows you to live without constantly preparing for a conflict that may never come. As the noise of imaginary conflicts begins to fade and your mind stops rehearsing battles that never happen, a quieter discomfort may still remain. A feeling that your life is somehow not enough, even when nothing is actively wrong. You may notice it while scrolling through other people's achievements, hearing about someone else's success, or remembering the path you thought you would be on by now. It is not loud like anger or fear. It is subtle, persistent, and deeply tiring. There is a heaviness that comes from measuring your life against a story that was never yours. Comparison often appears harmless because it is normalized. From an early age, you are taught to evaluate yourself through grades, rankings, performance, and social approval. This conditioning turns comparison into an automatic habit. The mind scans for where you stand relative to others, as if your worth depends on your position in an invisible hierarchy. Yet comparison is not just a judgment of yourself, it is a rejection of your current reality. When you focus on someone else's path as the standard, you implicitly declare your own path insufficient. This creates tension because life continues unfolding in its own way, while the mind insists it should look different. Buddhist teachings emphasize that suffering arises from craving and aversion. Comparison contains both. Craving for what another person has and aversion toward what you currently experience. This dual tension keeps the mind restless, unable to settle into contentment. Comparison also distorts perception. You see fragments of others' lives, highlights, outcomes, visible successes, without the context of their struggles, timing, or sacrifices. Meanwhile, you see your own life in full detail, including uncertainty and doubt. This imbalance makes others appear complete and yourself incomplete. The mind uses comparison to avoid confronting its own path. If someone else seems to have a better life, it is easier to focus on their story than to engage with the complexity of your own. This avoidance prevents growth because energy is directed outward rather than inward. There is also the illusion of a single correct timeline, the belief that by a certain age or stage, specific milestones should be achieved. When reality diverges from this imagined schedule, comparison intensifies. You feel late, behind, or lost, even though life does not operate on uniform timing. Identity becomes fragile under constant comparison. If your sense of self depends on outperforming others, any success they experience can feel like a threat. This creates subtle hostility or insecurity that undermines genuine connection. Comparison affects motivation as well. It can push you toward goals that are not aligned with your values simply because they are admired. You may pursue recognition instead of fulfillment, only to discover that external validation does not resolve internal dissatisfaction. Gratitude diminishes because attention is fixed on what is missing rather than what is present. Achievements feel temporary because they are immediately measured against someone else's accomplishments. Buddhist teachings encourage recognizing the uniqueness of each path. Conditions, opportunities, and circumstances differ for every individual. Expecting identical outcomes ignores this complexity. Acceptance of your specific conditions allows you to work with them rather than against them. Mindfulness interrupts comparison by returning focus to direct experience. Noticing what you are doing, feeling, and perceiving right now instead of evaluating it against an external reference. Presence reduces the mental space where comparison thrives. Self-compassion counters the harshness that often accompanies comparison. Acknowledging that struggle and uncertainty are universal experiences softens self-judgment. You are not failing at life, you are participating in it. Comparison also isolates you from your own intuition. When you constantly look outward for guidance, you lose contact with internal signals about what feels meaningful. Reconnecting with these signals restores direction. Relationships improve when comparison decreases. Instead of viewing others as benchmarks, you see them as companions with their own journeys. This shift fosters empathy and collaboration rather than competition. Creativity flourishes when you stop measuring originality against existing models. You allow ideas to emerge from your perspective rather than trying to replicate someone else's success. There is also relief in accepting that you cannot live multiple lives simultaneously. Choosing one direction means releasing others. Comparison keeps those unchosen possibilities alive as sources of regret, instead of honoring the reality of your decisions. Letting go of comparison does not mean ignoring inspiration. You can appreciate others' achievements without turning them into judgments about yourself. Inspiration motivates without diminishing your own path. Time feels different without constant evaluation. You become less preoccupied with how long something takes and more engaged with the process itself. Patience increases because you trust that progress unfolds uniquely. Confidence grows from alignment rather than superiority. Knowing that you are moving according to your values provides stability that external rankings cannot offer. Peace emerges as acceptance deepens. You stop fighting the fact that your life looks different from someone else's. Differences become neutral rather than threatening. Energy returns because it is no longer spent on maintaining an internal scoreboard. You engage more fully with your activities because you are not simultaneously monitoring others' progress. Joy becomes accessible again because you allow yourself to enjoy what you have without comparing it to what you lack. Satisfaction no longer feels like complacency. Purpose clarifies when it is not overshadowed by external expectations. You recognize that fulfillment comes from living authentically rather than meeting imagined standards. Comparison often resurfaces during moments of vulnerability, but awareness allows you to notice it without being consumed by it. You can redirect attention toward appreciation and curiosity. There is also humility in recognizing that everyone experiences unseen struggles. This understanding dissolves envy and replaces it with compassion. Your path becomes visible when you stop looking sideways. Decisions feel clearer because they are not influenced by constant evaluation. Life feels less like a competition and more like a journey with varied routes. Some paths are faster, some slower, some more scenic, some more challenging. None are inherently superior because they lead to different experiences. And in this quiet shift, you discover that rejecting comparison is not about lowering ambition. It is about reclaiming your life from a narrative that was never designed for you. When you stop idolizing another path, you finally see the depth and possibility within your own. Exhaustion fades because you are no longer trying to walk two roads at once. You are simply moving forward on the one beneath your feet, grounded, present, and free from the weight of someone else's story. As comparison loosens its grip and you stop measuring your path against someone else's, another hidden burden can surface, not directed at a person, but at life itself. A quiet sense that something unfair happened, that circumstances did not cooperate, that doors closed when they should have opened. Even after you move forward, a trace of bitterness may remain, not loud enough to notice daily, but heavy enough to shape how you feel about the world. There is a kind of resentment that has no clear target, only a lingering question of why things turned out the way they did. This is the weight of unforgiven reality. It forms when painful experiences are not only remembered, but resisted. When part of you refuses to accept that what happened cannot be undone. You may not consciously think about it often, yet it influences your mood, your expectations, and your trust in life. Grudges are usually associated with people, but sometimes the resentment is broader, toward time for moving too fast, toward missed opportunities, toward circumstances that limited your choices, toward illness, loss, or endings that arrived without warning. When there is no person to blame, the mind may turn its frustration toward existence itself. This kind of resentment creates a subtle hostility toward the present. If life once disappointed you deeply, you may expect it to do so again. Even positive moments are approached cautiously, as if joy might be withdrawn at any moment. The past casts a shadow that colors future experiences. Buddhist teachings emphasize that suffering often comes from attachment to how things should have been. When you replay alternate versions of events, you reinforce dissatisfaction with what actually occurred. This keeps emotional wounds active long after the situation has ended. Unforgiven reality also distorts perception of fairness. The mind searches for balance, wanting good outcomes to follow good behavior and bad outcomes to follow mistakes. When life violates this expectation, it feels unjust. Accepting randomness or complexity can be difficult because it challenges the belief that everything happens for a clear reason. Holding resentment toward life drains energy because it keeps attention anchored in the past. You may continue to carry emotional weight from situations that no longer exist. The body responds as if the experience is still ongoing, maintaining tension and vigilance. There is also grief hidden beneath resentment. Anger often protects against the vulnerability of sadness. Acknowledging loss requires facing the depth of what mattered, which can feel overwhelming. Resentment creates distance from that pain, but prevents healing. Forgiveness in this context is not about condoning what happened. It is about releasing the expectation that reality should have followed a different script. It allows you to stop arguing with events that cannot be changed. Acceptance of reality restores connection to the present. When you stop comparing now to what might have been, you notice what is actually available. Possibilities that were invisible under the weight of regret begin to appear. Self-forgiveness is often part of this process. You may blame yourself for decisions made with limited knowledge or under pressure. Recognizing that you acted according to what you understood at the time softens this blame. Compassion toward your past self creates continuity instead of conflict. You see your life as a series of adaptations rather than a chain of mistakes. This perspective reduces shame and increases understanding. Letting go of resentment also improves physical health. Chronic bitterness keeps stress responses active, affecting sleep, digestion, and immunity. Emotional release allows the body to return to balance. Relationships benefit because unresolved resentment can spill into interactions with others. You may become guarded, skeptical, or distant without realizing why. Healing past wounds opens space for trust. There is also freedom in accepting that not all questions will have satisfying answers. Some experiences remain ambiguous or unfair. Peace does not require full understanding. It requires willingness to live without certainty. Mindfulness practices help by grounding attention in immediate sensations rather than narratives about the past. Observing breath, movement, and sound anchors you in the present, reducing the pull of unresolved memories. Gratitude gradually counterbalances resentment. Acknowledging what is supportive in your life does not erase pain, but expands perspective. You see that life contains both difficulty and generosity. Purpose can emerge from past hardship. Experiences that once felt meaningless may later shape empathy, resilience, or insight. This reframing transforms resentment into a source of strength. Impermanence plays a role here as well. Recognizing that even painful memories change over time reduces their intensity. Emotional reactions soften as distance increases, making forgiveness possible. Letting go of grudges against reality does not mean forgetting. It means remembering without reliving. You carry lessons instead of wounds. There is also humility in acknowledging that life's complexity exceeds personal expectations. You participate in a larger unfolding that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. Peace grows when you stop demanding that the past justify itself. You allow it to exist as part of your story without dominating it. Energy returns because you are no longer maintaining resistance to what has already happened. The mind becomes quieter, less preoccupied with revisiting old scenarios. Joy becomes more accessible because you are not filtering present experiences through unresolved disappointment. You allow yourself to feel happiness without guilt or suspicion. Hope reappears not as naive optimism, but as openness to possibility. You trust that life can still offer meaningful experiences even after loss. Resilience strengthens because you recognize your capacity to endure and adapt. Past pain becomes evidence of survival rather than proof of fragility. The future feels less threatening when you release the belief that it must compensate for the past. You approach it with curiosity instead of expectation. And in this gentle release, you discover that forgiveness of reality is not a single decision, but an ongoing practice. Each time you choose presence over resentment, you lighten the load you carry. The exhaustion that once came from holding on to what cannot change begins to dissolve. What remains is a quiet steadiness, the ability to live fully in the moment without dragging the weight of yesterday behind you. As the weight of unforgiven reality begins to lift, and you stop carrying the past like a hidden burden, another pattern becomes easier to recognize: the constant urge to stay occupied. Even when nothing urgent needs attention, the mind searches for tasks, distractions, noise, anything to avoid the stillness that follows when resentment fades. You may find yourself filling empty moments automatically, not because you want to, but because silence feels unfamiliar. There is a restlessness that appears the moment life slows down, as if stopping would expose something you are not ready to face. Busyness often looks productive on the surface. It can bring achievements, recognition, and a sense of control. But beneath that activity, there may be avoidance. Avoidance of emotions that were never processed, questions that were never answered, or truths that feel too heavy to acknowledge. Movement becomes a shield against introspection. When you are constantly occupied, there is little space for reflection. Thoughts remain shallow because they are interrupted by the next task. Feelings remain muted because attention is directed outward. This can create the illusion of stability while unresolved issues quietly accumulate. Buddhist teachings point to the discomfort of stillness as a sign of inner conflict rather than a flaw in stillness itself. When the mind resists silence, it is often because silence removes distractions that kept deeper concerns hidden. Without activity, there is nothing to outrun. Busyness can become a form of anesthesia. It dulls awareness of pain without addressing its source. Like numbing an injury without treating it, the discomfort returns once the effect wears off. This cycle encourages more activity, reinforcing the pattern. There is also social reinforcement for busyness. Being busy is often equated with importance. Saying you are overwhelmed can earn sympathy or admiration, making it harder to question whether the activity is necessary. Rest, on the other hand, may feel undeserved or even suspicious. The body pays a price for constant motion. Chronic activity without recovery depletes energy reserves, disrupts sleep, and weakens attention. You may feel exhausted, yet unable to relax, caught between fatigue and restlessness. Busyness also narrows awareness of time. Days blur together because they are filled with similar tasks. Without pauses for reflection, experiences are not fully processed, leading to a sense that life is passing quickly without depth. Avoidance through activity often masks fear of change. If you stop moving, you may realize that certain aspects of your life no longer align with your values. Continuing to stay busy delays decisions that feel daunting. Relationships can suffer as well. When schedules are always full, meaningful connection becomes secondary to obligations. Conversations may revolve around logistics rather than emotional exchange, creating distance even among close individuals. Mindfulness interrupts this pattern by bringing attention to intention. Asking why you are engaging in a particular activity reveals whether it serves a genuine purpose or functions as distraction. This awareness allows you to choose differently. Learning to sit with discomfort gradually reduces the need for constant movement. Short periods of intentional stillness teach the nervous system that nothing catastrophic happens when you stop. Over time, tolerance for quiet increases. Creative insights often arise during these pauses. When the mind is not occupied with tasks, it has space to integrate information and generate new ideas. What once felt like wasted time becomes a source of clarity. Acceptance grows in stillness because you can observe reality without interference. You notice emotions, thoughts, and sensations as they are, not as you wish them to be. This observation weakens denial and fosters understanding. There is also relief in recognizing that not every moment must be optimized. Life includes periods of productivity and periods of rest, both necessary for balance. Treating rest as valuable reduces guilt associated with slowing down. Gratitude becomes easier to access when you are not rushing. You notice details that were previously overlooked: the texture of air, the rhythm of breath, the presence of others. Awareness deepens because attention is not fragmented. Energy begins to stabilize as you alternate activity with restoration. Tasks feel less overwhelming because you approach them with replenished resources. Purpose clarifies when you are not buried under constant obligations. You can distinguish between what truly matters and what was pursued out of habit or expectation. There is courage in facing uncomfortable truths that surface during quiet moments. Acknowledging dissatisfaction, grief, or uncertainty allows healing to begin. Avoidance prolongs suffering, while acceptance opens the possibility of change. Busyness often fades naturally as acceptance increases. You no longer need to distract yourself from reality because reality feels less threatening. Activity becomes intentional rather than compulsive. Joy returns in simple experiences. Without the pressure to achieve constantly, you can appreciate being rather than doing. Presence becomes fulfilling in itself. Time feels expansive rather than scarce. Moments are experienced fully instead of rushed through, creating a sense of richness even in ordinary days. Relationships deepen because you are available emotionally, not just physically. Listening becomes attentive, conversations become meaningful, connection becomes nourishing. Confidence grows from knowing you can face yourself without escape. This confidence is quieter than achievement-based confidence, but more stable because it is not dependent on external validation. Peace emerges as a natural state when avoidance subsides. You are no longer running from your own experience. Life feels less like a race and more like a rhythm you can move with. And in that stillness, you discover that activity was never the solution to discomfort. It was a temporary diversion from what needed attention. When you allow space for acceptance, exhaustion softens into calm awareness. You realize that doing less can sometimes reveal more clarity, more connection, more life. As the need to stay constantly busy begins to loosen and you allow moments of stillness without rushing to fill them, something quieter becomes noticeable. The stream of explanations running in the background of your mind, stories about who you are, why things happened, what others meant, what the future will look like. Even when you stop moving, the narrative continues, as if silence threatens the identity those stories protect. There is a fatigue that does not come from doing too much, but from constantly explaining your life to yourself. The mind creates narratives to make reality feel predictable. By turning experiences into stories, it tries to impose order on uncertainty. These stories can provide comfort, but they also require maintenance. Every new event must be interpreted in a way that fits the existing storyline. If something contradicts it, tension appears. Maintaining a self-image demands constant filtering of information. You may ignore evidence that challenges how you see yourself or exaggerate details that confirm it. This selective attention consumes mental energy because reality rarely stays consistent with a single narrative. Buddhist teachings describe the self as a collection of changing processes rather than a fixed identity. When you cling to a rigid story about who you are, you resist this fluid nature. The effort to keep the story intact becomes exhausting because it conflicts with ongoing change. Narratives about others require similar effort. Once you decide someone is trustworthy or untrustworthy, kind or selfish, every interaction is interpreted through that lens. This reduces openness and increases miscommunication because you respond to the story rather than the person in front of you. Emotional reactions are amplified by narratives. A small disappointment can feel overwhelming if it fits a story of being unlucky or misunderstood. Conversely, positive experiences may be minimized if they contradict a narrative of inadequacy. Stories also shape memory. You remember events in ways that reinforce your beliefs, gradually editing out details that do not fit. Over time, the narrative feels like objective truth, even though it has been constructed selectively. There is a subtle fear beneath this process. Without a clear story, identity can feel uncertain. The mind prefers a flawed narrative to no narrative at all because ambiguity feels unsafe. Letting go of rigid stories requires tolerance for not knowing exactly who you are at every moment. Mindfulness disrupts narrative maintenance by focusing on direct experience rather than interpretation. Instead of asking what something means about you, attention shifts to what is happening right now. Sensations, emotions, thoughts as they arise. This shift reduces the need to defend identity. You can observe feelings without labeling them as evidence of a fixed personality. Anger becomes an emotion passing through rather than proof of being an angry person. Flexibility emerges when narratives loosen. You become more responsive to changing circumstances because you are not bound by expectations of how you should behave. Growth becomes possible because identity is no longer confined to past patterns. Relationships improve because you listen without projecting predetermined roles onto others. Curiosity replaces assumption, allowing genuine understanding to develop. There is also relief in recognizing that you do not need a complete explanation for everything. Life includes contradictions and ambiguity that cannot be resolved into neat stories. Accepting this complexity reduces mental strain. Forgiveness becomes easier when you release narratives of blame. You see actions in context rather than as fixed character traits. This perspective fosters compassion without denying accountability. Creativity increases because the mind is not occupied with maintaining coherence. Ideas can explore new directions without being constrained by how they fit into an existing self-concept. Decision-making becomes clearer when it is guided by present values rather than past narratives. You choose based on what feels aligned now instead of what maintains consistency with previous choices. The body relaxes as cognitive tension decreases. Muscles that were subtly contracted from constant mental effort begin to release, allowing deeper breathing and calmer posture. Joy arises more naturally because experiences are not filtered through evaluation. You allow yourself to enjoy moments without questioning whether they fit your story. Grief also moves more freely when not constrained by narratives of strength or resilience. You can acknowledge vulnerability without seeing it as weakness. Authenticity grows because you are less concerned with performing a role. Actions become expressions of current understanding rather than attempts to uphold an image. Time feels different without narrative preoccupation. You spend less energy revisiting the past or predicting the future, creating space for presence. Confidence stabilizes because it is no longer dependent on maintaining a particular identity. You trust your ability to adapt rather than your ability to remain consistent. Peace deepens as mental noise decreases. Without constant storytelling, the mind experiences periods of quiet awareness that feel spacious and restorative. There is also humility in recognizing that others are navigating their own narratives. This awareness fosters patience and reduces judgment. Purpose becomes less about proving a story and more about engaging with life directly. Meaning arises from participation rather than interpretation. Energy returns because you are no longer sustaining elaborate explanations. Simplicity replaces complexity, allowing attention to rest. And in this quiet clarity, you discover that you do not need to hold your life together with words. Reality does not require a narrative to exist. When you release the effort to define everything, experience becomes immediate and vivid. Exhaustion gives way to a calm presence that does not need justification. You are simply here, alive, aware, and free from the weight of maintaining a story that was never as solid as it seemed. As the stories about who you are begin to loosen, and you no longer feel the need to explain every thought or feeling, a new space opens, quiet, unstructured, and unfamiliar. Without constant narration, there is nothing to hide behind, no role to perform, no identity to defend, just awareness itself, steady and unoccupied. Yet this stillness can feel unsettling, as if something important has been removed. There is a moment when silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling exposed. Doing nothing sounds simple, but for many people it triggers discomfort almost immediately. The body may become restless, the mind starts searching for stimulation, and a subtle anxiety appears without a clear cause. It is not boredom alone. It is the confrontation with everything that activity used to cover. Stillness removes distractions that normally keep inner conflict out of sight. Thoughts that were pushed aside during busy hours return. Feelings that were postponed demand attention. Without movement to redirect awareness, unresolved experiences surface naturally. The mind often interprets this as a threat because it is unfamiliar territory. Activity has been associated with safety and productivity, while stillness has been associated with vulnerability. Sitting quietly can feel like losing control because there is nothing to manage or fix. Buddhist teachings describe stillness as a gateway to insight rather than a void. When external noise decreases, internal patterns become visible. This visibility can be uncomfortable at first, not because something is wrong, but because it reveals what has been ignored. The nervous system plays a role in this reaction. If you are accustomed to constant stimulation, slowing down can feel like withdrawal. The body expects input and becomes agitated when it does not receive it. Over time, this agitation can settle, but only if you allow it to pass without escaping into distraction. Fear of stillness is often linked to fear of unresolved emotions. If sadness, anger, or regret have been suppressed, quiet moments may allow them to surface. Avoiding stillness becomes a way to avoid feeling. There is also the loss of external validation. Activity often brings feedback from others, reinforcing a sense of purpose. In silence, there is no audience, no measurement of worth. Identity must stand without reinforcement, which can feel uncertain. Stillness challenges the belief that value comes from doing. When you are not producing, achieving, or responding, you may question your usefulness. This discomfort reveals how deeply productivity is tied to self-worth. Learning to tolerate stillness begins with short periods of intentional quiet. Observing sensations without reacting builds familiarity. The mind gradually learns that silence does not erase identity. It reveals a deeper layer of it. Breathing becomes an anchor during these moments. Noticing the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation provides stability when thoughts become overwhelming. It reminds the body that life continues even without activity. Awareness of the environment also grounds attention. Sounds, temperature, and light become more vivid when the mind is not preoccupied. This sensory connection reduces the sense of isolation that silence can bring. Acceptance of discomfort is essential. Trying to force relaxation can create additional tension. Allowing unease to exist without judgment helps it dissipate naturally. Over time, stillness transforms from threatening to restorative. Energy replenishes because the mind is not constantly processing information. Clarity emerges because attention is no longer fragmented. Creativity often appears in these quiet spaces. Ideas that were buried under noise surface spontaneously. Solutions to problems arise without deliberate effort. Emotional regulation improves as you become familiar with your internal landscape. Instead of reacting impulsively, you recognize feelings early and respond thoughtfully. Relationships benefit because you bring presence rather than distraction into interactions. Listening becomes deeper. Communication more sincere. Confidence grows from knowing you can face yourself without escape. This self-trust reduces dependence on external stimulation. Spiritual insight can also deepen in stillness. Without the constant assertion of identity, a sense of connection to something larger may emerge, whether understood as nature, humanity, or existence itself. Time feels expansive rather than compressed. Moments are experienced fully instead of rushed through, creating a sense of abundance even in ordinary situations. Peace becomes less dependent on circumstances because it arises from within rather than from external conditions. There is also a subtle joy in simply being alive, independent of accomplishments. This joy is quiet but enduring, not easily disrupted by changes in fortune. Stillness teaches patience by showing that not everything needs immediate action. Some situations resolve through waiting rather than intervention. Resilience strengthens because you are not overwhelmed by silence or uncertainty. You develop the ability to remain steady even when external support is absent. Perspective shifts as you realize that constant activity was not necessary for survival. Life continues whether you are busy or still. Gratitude becomes more accessible because you notice details that were previously overlooked. Small experiences gain significance. Authenticity deepens because you are not performing for anyone. Actions arise from genuine intention rather than expectation. Freedom emerges from the absence of compulsion. You choose activity when it is meaningful, not because you are afraid to stop. And in this quiet recognition, stillness no longer feels like emptiness. It becomes a refuge where the mind can rest and the heart can settle. The threat dissolves because you understand that silence is not exposing weakness, it is revealing truth. Exhaustion fades as the struggle against quiet ends, replaced by a calm awareness that does not need noise to exist. As stillness becomes less threatening and you learn to sit quietly without escaping into noise, another layer of tension can surface, not about the present moment, but about the future you once believed was guaranteed. When the mind no longer runs from silence, it begins to notice the gap between what you expected life to be and what it actually is. In that gap, anxiety quietly grows. There is a kind of fear that does not come from danger, but from the realization that the story you trusted may never unfold the way you imagined. From an early age, you are handed a script. It may come from family, culture, education, or media. A sequence of milestones that supposedly leads to happiness, certain achievements, certain relationships, certain timelines. These expectations form a mental blueprint for how life should progress. When reality follows a different path, it can feel like something has gone wrong, even if nothing is truly broken. Rigid expectations create a fragile sense of control. If you believe life will unfold according to a plan, uncertainty feels manageable. But when unexpected changes occur, delays, losses, detours, the mind interprets them as threats rather than natural variations. Anxiety arises not because uncertainty exists, but because it contradicts the script. Buddhist teachings emphasize impermanence as a fundamental truth. Everything changes, including plans, identities, and circumstances. When you resist this reality, you experience suffering. Accepting unpredictability does not eliminate difficulty, but it reduces the shock when life moves in unexpected directions. Fear of deviation from the script often comes from attachment to identity. You may have imagined yourself as a certain kind of person by a certain stage of life. When reality does not confirm that image, it can feel like losing part of yourself. The discomfort is less about external events and more about internal disorientation. Comparison intensifies this fear. Seeing others appear to follow the expected path reinforces the belief that you are off track. Yet appearances rarely reveal the complexity behind someone's journey. Each life unfolds through unique circumstances that cannot be replicated. The mind also clings to the idea that happiness lies at the end of the script. If the sequence is disrupted, it fears that fulfillment will never arrive. This creates urgency and pressure, making every deviation feel catastrophic. Letting go of rigid expectations requires redefining success as adaptability rather than achievement. Progress becomes the ability to respond to change with resilience instead of forcing reality to conform to a plan. Trust develops when you recognize that uncertainty has always been part of life, even during periods that felt stable. The illusion of predictability dissolves, revealing a dynamic process rather than a fixed trajectory. Flexibility allows new opportunities to emerge. When you are not fixated on a specific outcome, you notice possibilities that were previously ignored because they did not fit the script. Creativity thrives in this openness. You begin to design your life intentionally rather than following inherited expectations. Choices become expressions of personal values rather than attempts to meet external standards. Resilience grows as you face uncertainty repeatedly and discover your capacity to adapt. Each challenge becomes evidence that you can navigate the unknown. Relationships deepen because you connect with others authentically, instead of performing roles defined by the script. Vulnerability replaces the pressure to appear successful. There is also relief in acknowledging that no one fully understands how life will unfold. Even those who seem confident are navigating uncertainty behind the scenes. Mindfulness anchors you in the present rather than projecting anxiety into the future. Attention shifts from hypothetical scenarios to actual experiences, reducing unnecessary worry. Gratitude becomes easier when you stop postponing happiness until the script is fulfilled. You appreciate what exists now instead of waiting for an ideal outcome. Purpose evolves from a fixed destination into an ongoing process of growth. Meaning arises from engagement with life rather than completion of a checklist. The fear of unpredictability gradually transforms into curiosity. Instead of dreading what might happen, you become interested in discovering what will unfold. Confidence stabilizes because it is no longer tied to specific achievements. You trust your ability to handle whatever comes rather than relying on a predetermined plan. Peace emerges when you release the demand for certainty. You allow life to be complex and unscripted without interpreting that complexity as failure. Time feels less oppressive because you are not racing against imagined deadlines. You move at a pace that aligns with your circumstances rather than external expectations. Joy becomes more accessible because you are not evaluating experiences based on how well they match the script. You allow moments to be meaningful in their own way. There is humility in recognizing that control was always limited. Accepting this limitation reduces frustration and fosters compassion for yourself and others. Freedom grows as you realize that the absence of a script allows genuine choice. You are not confined to a predetermined role. You can redefine your path repeatedly. And in this quiet acceptance, the fear that life might not match the script begins to dissolve. You see that existence was never meant to follow a single storyline. It is fluid, unpredictable, and alive. Exhaustion fades because you are no longer trying to force reality into a rigid shape. What remains is a calm readiness to meet life as it unfolds, moment by moment, without needing it to be anything other than what it is. You were never exhausted because life was too heavy. You were exhausted because you were fighting what already is, resisting the past, arguing with the present, fearing a future that refuses to follow your script. Every lesson you heard tonight points to the same quiet truth. Suffering grows where resistance lives, and energy returns the moment acceptance begins. When you stop trying to control what cannot be controlled, stop replaying what cannot be changed, and stop comparing your path to one that was never yours, something inside you softens. The noise fades, the tension loosens, and in that space, peace does not arrive from outside. It rises from within, steady, grounded, unshakable. Reality was never your enemy. It was the fight against it that drained you. If something in this message touched a place you don't usually show, leave a comment with one word that describes how you feel right now. Not for anyone else, for you. Sometimes naming the truth is the first step to releasing it. And if you want more teachings that quiet the mind, strengthen the spirit, and help you sleep with a lighter heart, subscribe to the channel and return whenever the world feels heavy. There is always another reminder waiting here for you.